Chapter 1082. Li Huaqing. Jianghu. Either of these two people was enough to attract the absolute attention of everyone present. When the two names were combined, the deterrence produced was definitely not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. If the academics cooperated with Jianghu, the chemical reaction would be extremely amazing. Similarly, Li Tianlan was also very clear that such a possibility existed, and the probability was not low. At this moment he suddenly remembered the conversation he had with Zhuang Huayang, the headmaster when he first entered the Sky Academy. A 10-year plan. At that time, Li Tianlan, who was far from amazing, was solemnly invited by Zhuang Huayang to join the academics in order to use 10 years to let Li Tianlan grow up and make up for some structural defects of the academics. The academics' shortcomings were not only that it had a short time to rise and did not establish close ties with some retired but influential old people. They also had a huge lack of voice in the dark world and the special warfare system. In this respect, it was indispensable within any group. What did the special warfare system in the dark world mean? To be precise, it meant a special power outside the rules. A high degree of freedom, even the power to act first and report later, and the characteristic of not being bound by ordinary laws. In any group, such a power could play a role that could not be ignored. The foundation of the academics in this respect was almost zero. Therefore they always seemed to be very passive when playing with other groups. That was because they abided by the rules, and even if they wanted to break the rules they had no bargaining chips to do so. The special warfare system was the order in the shadow of Jianghu state. From the perspective of Jianghu state, the darkness itself was a kind of order. Nearly 6 years ago, Li Tianlan, who was only the heir of the Li family at that time, attracted the personal attention of Li Huaqing. Li Huaqing instructed Zhuang Huayang to invite Li Tianlan to join the academics, and then facilitated the short-term cooperation between the giant group, the academy, the Samsara palace, and the Li family. From this point alone, it could be seen how strong the academics' voice in the special warfare system and their desire for masters were. Li Tianlan's growth might have twists and turns, but on the whole it was smooth. However, in a few years the general trend changed and Li Tianlan gradually drifted away from the academics. At this time, especially when the special warfare group was in turmoil, Jianghu and Li Huaqing secretly contacted each other. Did Li Huaqing intend to make Jianghu the core figure of the academics in the special warfare system? In contemplation, Bai Qingzhao was the first to speak. His tone was a little doubtful, but it was relatively soft. Mr. Xinyuan, you also said that this is a secret contact between the president and Jianghu. May I ask how you know about this? Xinyuan Wushang looked at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan nodded slightly, indicating that everyone present could be absolutely trusted. Xinyuan Wushang smiled and said softly, I can hack into the entire network of East Island, control their weapon systems and enter their core database. Naturally, I can also enter the core database of Jianghu State to see something. In fact, although the network protection of Jianghu State is much more advanced than that of East Island, there is no qualitative change. I checked Li Huaqing's communication record and saw the conversation between him and Jianghu. The time was 26 minutes. Starting from this point, it's easy for me to investigate something. The only pity is that I don't know what exactly they talked about. There was dead silence in the study. 2 seconds later, Dongqing Wudi suddenly stood up and stared at Xinyuan Wushang with burning eyes. Everyone looked at his seemingly harmless smiling face. A dog that bites doesn't bark. Although there was something wrong with this description, they all had the same thought in their minds. Dongqing Wudi looked at the fat man in front of him seriously, as if he wanted to record his appearance in his mind. The way he looked at Xinyuan Wushang was strange and complicated. It was as if he was looking at a devil, an angel, or a nuclear bomb that could destroy the entire world or something else. He could freely hack into the core database of Jianghu State and East Island, freely tamper with all the communications of a country, and freely control all the weapon systems. What did this mean? It was clear just by looking at East Island the night before. If what Xinyuan Wushang said was true. No, what he said was true. The 3 fleets of Murderous Bird, Giant Whale and Black Dragon had now been incorporated by the Jianghu State Navy. For this matter, Dongqing Wudi talked with Li Huaqing for a long time. Although this matter hadn't been discussed in a parliamentary meeting, the general direction had been confirmed. These 3 fleets would be incorporated into the South Sea Fleet and become the strength of the new group in the Navy. The 3 fleets would be merged into an aircraft carrier fleet, and Li Tianlan would personally appoint the commander and be awarded the rank of lieutenant general. The 3 fleets and the slow response of East Island for a whole night were the embodiment of Xinyuan Wushang's real strength. Except for the fat man in front of him, No one knew what happened in East Island that night. In that state, East Island was in a state of war. All the communications were interacting with each other at a high frequency. The imperial family, the cabinet, the army ministry, all the major martial arts schools, the rear of East Island, the front of Beihai, the special warfare system, countless departments, and countless people were exchanging information at any time. In such a highly vigilant situation, Shenyuan Wushang easily got the control of all the weapon systems in East Island and controlled all the communication networks. In that state, there were countless phone calls communicating with each other every minute and every second. If one of the phone calls made people feel that something was wrong, the delicate but extremely fragile network that Shenyuan Wushang weaved would be completely broken. But under such circumstances, Shenyuan Wushang didn't have any accident, and everyone was completely fooled by the false communication. For East Island, this was a dream. In the dream, Shenyuan Wushang was an angel. When he woke up from the dream, Shenyuan Wushang directly turned into a devil. This kind of person, this kind of ability should be respected and valued at the highest level in any country. When everyone was confused about East Island's behavior last night, the culprit showed up right beside them. It was him. He actually did it. If Jianghu State had such a person, Dongqing Wudi was a very arrogant person, but at the same time he was also a person with extreme self-restraint. But when he saw Shenyuan Wushang and thought of East Island last night, even with his self-restraint, a logical idea directly popped up in his mind. With Shenyuan Wushang, Jianghu State could completely unify the whole world. What a ridiculous statement. What a crazy ambition. Unifying the whole world became the supreme will of hundreds of countries. This sounded inconceivable, but at this moment, it seemed so logical. Shenyuan Wushang could play East Island in the palm of his hand, which meant that the so-called top-secret and perfect firewalls of any country in Jianghu State, Star State, Snow Country, European land, or any other country in the world were useless in front of him. Hypothetically, under such circumstances, Jianghu State could completely invade without any scruples. Counterattack? There would be no such thing. When Shenyuan Wushang controlled the enemy's weapon system, the only counterattack the enemy could do was to use manpower and some guns. This level of control could even make all the high-tech weapons of the enemy turn around to attack their own country. To unify the whole world, Jianghu State would not even sacrifice the life of a soldier. It was so crazy, so absurd. Whether Jianghu State had such an idea or not, Dongqing Wudi was a soldier. A soldier's duty was not only to protect the country, but also to expand the territory. At this moment, Shenyuan Wushang in front of him was undoubtedly a treasure, which made him extremely surprised and terrified. Such an ability could indeed unify the whole world. But if there was really such a so-called unification, then did all this have anything to do with Jianghu State? Rather than saying that Jianghu State unified the world, it was better to say that Shenyuan Wushang unified the world alone. Such an ability was so obvious that it had nothing to do with Emperor Dong's palace. That kind of unscrupulous invasion was almost everywhere and impossible to guard against. In everyone's eyes, such a Shenyuan Wushang was both a devil and a god. Dongqing Wudi just looked at Shenyuan Wushang. There was a strong surprise in his eyes, and there was also undisguised cold-killing intent. No matter how strong Li Tianlan was, he was only one person after all. He might be able to fight against the whole world and hundreds of thousands of troops, but he was still one person. What he could guarantee was absolute domination in the dark world. Even if Li Tianlan was 100 times stronger, he could not destroy the whole world in an instant. Everyone would be afraid of him and would be afraid of him. The world could accommodate Li Tianlan. Shenyuan Wushang was different. Completely different. He had the ability to rule the world at will and destroy the world at will. Li Tianlan at least needed to draw his sword to kill. And he was just a simple invasion. He invaded Jianghu State, Snow Country, Star State, and any other country. With a bang, the world would be destroyed. What was this? What the hell was this? Such a person should not exist. His existence would be absolutely hostile and feared by everyone. If such a person's ability was exposed, the whole world would kill him at all costs, including Jianghu State. His existence made everyone feel that their life and death and future were all controlled by him. But in the face of that terrifying possibility, even Li Tianlan was a non-entity. Tianlan, can this person be trusted? Dongqing Wudi slowly turned his head to look at Li Tianlan, his eyes extremely solemn. Tianlan, kill him. Bai Zhanfang was silent for a long time before he slowly said. His tone was firm and tough. Kill? Wu Jingmin expressed his attitude without hesitation. No matter what, he has to die. Kill him. Zhou Mulin also said. Boundless killing intent completely surrounded Shenyuan Wushang. Xinyuan Wushang shrugged helplessly. He doesn't have this ability now. Li Tianlan shook his head and said the most important information. After a pause he said again, and he can be trusted. No one spoke. Li Tianlan frowned. Perhaps because he was facing his own people, he did not hide his dissatisfaction. I said he is my brother. Still silence. After a long time, Dongqing Wudi let out a long breath. His eyes were a little complicated. How did you do it? It's a prop. Xianyuan Wushang smiled and said, or you can understand it as me using that prop to temporarily replace the network system of East Island and invade their core database. That prop instantly simulated and analyzed the information of every person recorded in East Island from countless files, and instantly simulated countless personalities. This kind of ability is really scary. In fact, it wasn't just the top officials of East Island who were affected that night. There were a total of 40 million calls in East Island that night, including phone calls, videos, emails, and texts. All of these were intercepted by the special intelligences simulated by that prop. But that prop's ability also reached its limit, so after the battle in Beihai, that prop was also destroyed. What he said was half true and half false. For example, that prop. If he hadn't appeared in front of Li Tianlan with virtual travel and taken Li Tianlan to do another virtual travel, Xianyuan Wushang's glasses wouldn't have been destroyed. That pair of glasses could have allowed Xianyuan Wushang to travel in every corner and scrupulously and invade every secret location at will. Simulating tens of millions of intelligences in an instant was nothing for that pair of glasses. It was nothing. But the truth was that the glasses were indeed destroyed, and Xianyuan Wushang really didn't have the ability that made everyone so afraid. A prop? The giants in the study looked at each other for a while. Where did that so-called prop come from? Wu Jingmin asked in a deep voice. Xianyuan Wushang didn't mind their aggressive attitude and said slowly, it originally belonged to my sister. Later she gave it to me. For me it's the most precious thing. Where's your sister? Zhou Mulin looked serious. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a while, then said sadly, she's dead. Dongqing Wudi looked at Xianyuan Wushang seriously. His intuition told him that Xianyuan Wushang wasn't lying. He breathed a sigh of relief but also felt a little pity. If it was just a prop, its value would be completely different. What a pity, Wu Jingmin smiled and said, that prop? If it could still be used, it would be enough to be the most important strategic weapon of the country. Even if it could only be used once, it would be a great deterrent. This kind of weapon makes everything developed by other countries meaningless. The more advanced the weapons they develop, the more advanced they create for themselves. Such a value can be said to be far greater than a murderous weapon. Xianyuan Wushang twitched the corner of his mouth. He subconsciously wanted to say that it was nonsense but he held back. The murderous weapon of Miracle City was something he had always paid attention to, so he also knew some information. Obviously, when people here found King Wei, he was in an absolutely weak and seriously injured state. Even his consciousness was about to dissipate, leaving only a little instinct. With King Wei's particularity in the real environment of Miracle City, his injury could only get worse and worse, without any possibility of recovery. The so-called hermit family that first found King Wei had been guarding his body. No one knew how many years had passed before the Wang family of Beihai destroyed the hermit family and found the prestige that was on the verge of death. Countless high-tech devices were used at the same time, and finally King Wei's body and murderous weapon were barely decomposed, turning into the carefree and murderous weapon of today. At present, even if King Wei's body was reunited, he was still seriously injured and could die at any time. His power was completely incomparable to that of his heyday. But even so, once King Wei's body was reunited, his energy should be able to barely form a small circulation around Li Tianlan. With the supplement of Li Tianlan's sword energy, his energy could be self-sufficient. Its power was at least countless times stronger than that of ruthlessness at its peak. When Li Tianlan returned, King Wei in his heyday would be equivalent to the existence of the peak energy source. This was the only weapon that occupied the throne in the corridor of time and space over the incomparably long years. It was the weapon of the first emperor. If King Wei hadn't died with Li Tianlan, the current corridor of time and space might have been King Wei to take the position of King of War. Compared to King Wei, the little tool in front of him was nothing. Is there any more of such a prop? Bai Zhanfeng asked slowly. Xianyuan Wushang shook his head. No. The giants all breathed a sigh of relief. Some were glad but also disappointed. Their moods were extremely contradictory. That is to say, without that prop, no one in the world can invade at will like you, right? Dongqing Wudi asked. Xianyuan Wushang thought for a moment and grunted. Such people actually existed. The strength of Lin Shi's apostle was no less than that of his sister. If he did it himself, the effect would be many times better than that small prop. But he could indeed do it. Obviously they were now being targeted by the eldest princess. Under such circumstances, the most he could do now was to search for information and occasionally use virtual shuttle to escape for his life. The dignified apostle, whose destructive power was almost invincible among his peers, could only escape for his life and search for information. The corners of Xinyuan Wushang's mouth curled up slightly. He was somewhat gloating. That's the end of this matter. Dongqing Wudi said slowly, Tianlan, don't publicize this matter. It can't be explained clearly. As long as he is around you, it will cause others to be afraid, which is not a good thing. No one will believe that he can only use that ability once. As long as he is around, you will be in trouble. Such a person is a real devil in the eyes of his opponents, but in the eyes of his own people, he is equivalent to an angel. Once this kind of trouble is publicized, it may cause very bad results. Devil? Angel? Xinyuan Wushang laughed. In fact, my greatest wish is to be an angel. Unfortunately, at least so far, I haven't seen any hope of becoming an angel. Bai Zhanfang obviously didn't like Xinyuan Wushang. Seeing that the fat man was serious, he snorted and said grumpily, "Why don't you say you want to be a god?" God is the human definition of a powerful creature beyond the scope of understanding. This term is strictly abstract. In a sense, it doesn't exist. Even if it exists, a god may not be stronger than an angel. So you recognize an angel, but refuse to recognize a god. Li Tianlan suddenly added. No one else spoke. Instead, they looked at the two of them as if they were looking at a mentally disabled child. Jianghu state had always been a country of atheists. I'm just against the term God. I don't deny certain powers. Angel is just a title. As for a god, I agree with it. But even if it really exists, it shouldn't be called a god. It should be a superconsciousness that is above everything and creates all things. It's something we can't see. Specifically, we have another name for those who are like gods and have absolute power. It's about truth and irreplaceable. We call them. Xinyuan Wushang smiled and said softly, Master. Chapter 1083. On the way to the Chen family, the vehicles that set off from the Bai family's manor formed a row of majestic motorcade. The cars chosen by Dongqing Wudi, Zhou Mulin, Bai Zhanfang, and Wu Jingmin were all black flags specially made for leaders in Jianghu state. Li Tianlan's car was given to him by the master of Samsara Palace in the year of the chaos in Snow Country. It was a custom-made Rolls-Royce which was the only one in the world. Now it became Li Tianlan's car in Yuzhou. 5 cars lined up neatly in the front and back, surrounded by 4 escort cars, all of them Audis, quietly protecting the car in the middle. At the front there were 2 police cars for clearing the way. At this time, including the route from the Bai family to the Qin family, according to the traffic situation in Yuzhou, without police cars clearing the way, they might have to walk until the afternoon. Xinyuan Wushang was still Li Tianlan's driver. He held the steering wheel and seemed to be a little curious about this means of transportation. You haven't driven before? Li Tianlan asked in surprise. He had long noticed Xinyuan Wushang's curiosity about cars, but this interest lasted from the hotel to the Bai family's manor, and then from the manor to here. Li Tianlan couldn't help but despise him. Bumpkin. Indeed, I haven't driven before. Xinyuan Wushang sighed with emotion. I haven't even seen this thing before. It's too heavy, and it even needs to hold the steering wheel to control the direction. Tut, it's an antique among antiques. If it were here, someone would definitely pay a lot of money to collect it. There was one thing that Xinyuan Wushang didn't say. Anything that came from Miracle City, not to mention a car, even a handful of soil had great research value. What's your means of transportation? Li Tianlan asked casually. He had always thought that the group behind Xinyuan Wushang should be a hidden force living in a corner of a country on Earth. Maybe it was Africa or the west of subcontinent or somewhere else. Isolated from the world, they developed countless black technologies and discovered countless secrets. They closed themselves off from the world and rarely communicated with outsiders. But looking at it now, it didn't seem to be the case at all. No matter how little he interacted with outsiders, he should have seen a car before. Even if he hadn't, he should have seen a similar tractor. Xinyuan Wushang's curiosity about this luxurious vehicle wasn't because he was looking at something advanced. His gaze was more like he was admiring an ancient antique, just like how a modern person would look at a chariot from the Preaching dynasty. He was full of interest, but it was just an interest in collecting. Li Tianlan's expression was somewhat stiff. He could understand this interest, so naturally he could also understand the other meaning behind this interest. Even in modern times, not everyone liked antiques. Shenyuan Wuxiang had this kind of interest, so he liked this Rolls-Royce very much. It was like a normal person facing a bronze chariot with thousands of years of history. The only thought in their mind was, what the F***ck is this rubbish? It's a pile of scrap metal. So backward? Backward. So, were they the bumpkins in Shenyuan Wuxiang's eyes? We can use virtual shuttle to temporarily turn ourselves into data. In the later stage of the development of the quantum network, it is extremely compatible without any lag. The data stream that can be accommodated is beyond everyone's imagination. If we turn ourselves into data, we can go anywhere regardless of distance. Why do we need to use a car? Shenyuan Wuxiang said with a smile. Li Tianlan was a little dissatisfied and didn't believe it. Is something like virtual shuttle as common as bicycles in your world? This kind of technology is high-end anyway. Even if it's ordinary, the so-called quantum network should be your main communication channel, right? Just like the current internet, it turns people into data. If the data is turned into data by a super hacker, can he take advantage of the opportunity of turning himself into data to invade the inside of your quantum network? Don't you have any precautions for such a shuttle? It's not that exaggerated. Shenyuan Wuxiang smiled. But we do have precautions. Even in our world, virtual shuttle is a very high-end technology. But for me and the people around me, we can use it at any time. As for most people, Shenyuan Wuxiang thought for a moment and said, they don't use cars either. His eyes suddenly lit up. Big brother, I remember a few movies here. There's a guy who claims to be comparable to God with a mortal body. His equipment, to a certain extent, is close to our normal means of transportation. If you like, I can get a set of advanced, cutting-edge armor, but it's a little troublesome and takes some time. Li Tianlan thought for a moment, not sure which movie Shenyuan Wuxiang was talking about. After a while he found one that barely matched. You mean the Revenge Alliance? Shenyuan Wuxiang was a little confused. Iron Man? What's the difference? Isn't it just a role? Li Tianlan said grumpily, but his eyes were a little dazed. He had seen the whole series of movies and most of the derivatives mentioned by Shenyuan Wuxiang, but he had watched them with the company of another woman he hadn't heard from for a long time. Wang Yuetong was a die-hard fan of this series of movies. Li Tianlan glanced at them, but the two of them were not very interested in the rich man in iron armor who could fly in the sky and travel underground. Li Tianlan didn't have any special feelings for anyone, but Wang Yuetong admired the captain very much. Li Tianlan thought for a moment and asked, your means of transportation is iron armor? We call it a single mecha. Shenyuan Wuxiang smiled. It has nothing to do with steel. It's a strong interaction material. It can be used as a single person's means of transportation, and it can also be used to arm a small elite army for battle. Well, this kind of thing. I don't think I can carry it. He thought about it seriously and confirmed his idea again. Only a few super-large elite legions would be able to mass-produce individual mechas made of materials with strong interaction forces, making them look like normal equipment. However, even in the space-time corridor, this material was a strategic large-scale military resource. It was a strategic material that could be used for many purposes. All of them were made of protons and neutrons that were completely locked together by strong interaction forces. The surface was absolutely smooth, the temperature was at absolute zero, and it would reflect all electromagnetic waves. Its surface was indestructible, and it had an absolutely strong bearing capacity that far surpassed nanotechnology. This material was not only used to make individual mechas, but it was also one of the main materials used to seal the stars. And the so-called sealing a star, from the perspective of the people on Earth, was the so-called celestial giant structure project. To put it simply, it was the Dyson sphere in the concept of the people here. According to Shenyuan Wuxiang's understanding of Miracle City, there was currently nothing in any country in the world that could cause the slightest damage to such a mecha. Of course, this so-called nothing didn't include the complete King Wei. If such a mecha was the military version of the time corridor, it was usually equipped with a warp speed engine, image memory system, super thinking system, all-around armed control system, energy conversion resonance system, force field control system, infrasound weapon system, dark matter cannon, and the conventional version of the Star Destroyer cannon. This also meant that such a mecha didn't even need to be operated in the internal space. In the state of super thinking, just the mecha itself could carry out long-distance superluminal cruising and fixed-point teleportation. With the current level of development on Earth, even if Earth developed for 1,000 years, it would still be impossible to face such a mecha alone. Such a mecha could easily penetrate the entire Earth in its absolute speed, as simple as a bullet piercing through a piece of tofu. And any of the weapons equipped on the mecha itself could directly destroy the surface of the entire Earth in just a few dozen seconds. Such a mecha, whether in the Time Corridor, the God of War's realm, or the Human Emperor's palace, had a unified name. The code name was Calamity. With Xianyuan Wuxiang's identity as the ninth prince and a member of the Pinnacle Palace in the Time Corridor, there was no problem at all for him to get a Calamity mecha. But the point was that if this thing didn't go through special treatment, it would be like a locator in Miracle City, attracting countless malicious eyes. He drove the car, his eyes flashing for a while, but he didn't say anything. Li Tianlan looked at him expressionlessly. So, when you said you would get me a set just now, you were just making fun of me? No, I didn't. Xianyuan Wuxiang smiled. I don't have the means to deal with those troublesome things. After all, I'm just a doctor. But I should be able to find someone to get a set for you. Of course, it should be a collectible without weapons and various systems, with only basic navigation capabilities. It's not troublesome. It was indeed not troublesome. He didn't have such a mecha, and neither did Xing Tian. But Lin Shi did. To be exact, it was the apostle next to Lin Shi who had one. He was one of the oldest apostles in the Time Corridor. If his sister hadn't died, even if he was stronger than him, there would be a limit. How many Calamity mechas did the apostles have? Judging from the size of his sister's army at that time, this type of Calamity grade fully armed and equipped with different weapons to form a complete set of combat systems, in the hands of the apostles, would be counted in the hundreds of millions. That was the most conservative estimate. If it weren't for the restrictions of the real environment of Miracle City and the eyes of Princess Royal, when the apostles completely released their army, the number of Calamity mechas alone would be more than the total population of Miracle City. And the number of his other armies would be dozens of times more than that. Omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. As the pinnacle of the Order camp, this was the position that the human clan was currently at the limit of this path. It crushed everything at the same level, with the highest lethality and destruction. This was the Apostle of Destruction. It's not bad to get a set to play with. Li Tianlan nodded and said. He wasn't very interested in the mecha himself. It only had basic navigation ability, which meant that it couldn't even be compared to the state in the movies, not to mention the complete state of the mecha. With Li Tianlan's current strength, his physical strength was completely endless. The second heart could support him to squander the power of his dual wind and thunder veins unscrupulously. If Li Tianlan rushed from Yuzhou to Tianan Shenyuan City at full speed, even without Ruthless, it would take him no more than 3 hours on foot. During this time, Li Tianlan even had time to smoke a few cigarettes. This was not Li Tianlan's limit in the future. But it was already the limit of martial arts in the entire Dark World. But if he gave this mecha to Qin Weibai, she would probably like it very much. I'll get it for you after a while, big brother. Xianyuan Wuxiang laughed. Li Tianlan nodded carelessly. He had been thinking about the problem that Xianyuan Wuxiang had just mentioned. Their group didn't recognize God. Their disapproval was not a denial of the existence of God. They were just a simple denial of the word. They denied it. They believed that angels stood side by side with the so-called God. As for the power that the gods represented in their minds, they referred to it as Lord. Lord. This was a very profound title. Li Tianlan thought of the Bible. This word often appeared in the Bible. There was a Bible in his bedroom. Qin Weibai was an extremely devout believer. She occasionally prayed, but she didn't go to church. She disdained the Holy Land, but Li Tianlan could clearly feel her devoutness and tranquility. Did the so-called Lord that Xianyuan Wuxiang mentioned also mean this? If this was really what he meant, then Lord really existed? What is Lord? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. He had realized that Xianyuan Wuxiang could say a lot of things, but he couldn't say a lot of things. It depended on how Li Tianlan asked. At least the so-called mecha had already surpassed most people's understanding of technology, and then it made Li Tianlan's thoughts shift to another direction that he felt was a little absurd, a little fake, but it was also very true. Xianyuan Wuxiang hesitated for a moment, then said softly and quickly, "It's the authority." There were only 3 words in this short sentence. If he deliberately sped up, it would take him less than half a second. But what Li Tianlan heard was a chaotic noise. The malice of the world was boiling in Xianyuan Wuxiang's body, destroying countless cells in his body and sucking away the vitality of a large number of organs. Xianyuan Wuxiang's face turned pale for a moment, but there was a touch of eternal pride and arrogance in his eyes that seemed to be eternal and would never yield. Does it have anything to do with the Bible? Li Tianlan took a deep look at him and asked from another angle. Xinyuan Wushang was silent for a long time and didn't speak. The Rolls-Royce drove steadily on the road of Yuzhou, followed by Wu Jingmin's Hongqi. When the motorcade drove through a bustling street, Xinyuan Wushang let out a muffled groan and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He shook his head slowly and said, "No, it has nothing to do with the Bible. The Lord in the Bible, we prefer to call it the superconsciousness, which is beyond the scope of everyone's understanding. The Lord I'm talking about is like my father and—" He glanced at Li Tianlan and added the second half of the sentence in his heart, "as well as you and Qin Wei Bai. These things are very interesting." Li Tianlan thought silently. After thinking for a long time, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Interesting." Xinyuan Wushang laughed. His smile was a little bright and a little sad. "It's really interesting, of course it's interesting. To fight with heaven and earth, to stand side by side with heaven and earth, to be the enemy of the world. Survival, no matter when, is the most important thing." Xinyuan Wushang murmured to himself. "Everyone is trying to survive. This is instinct." Li Tianlan looked at him quietly. "Instinct ha, instinct ha." Xinyuan Wushang suddenly laughed wildly. He turned his head and looked at Li Tianlan seriously. "Big brother, do you have a goal?" "What do you mean?" Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows slightly. "It's a goal, an ideal, a dream. Whatever you say, it's a height you've been pursuing but haven't reached for the time being." Xinyuan Wushang repeated it very seriously. "Goal, ideal, dream," Li Tianlan murmured to himself. After a full 2 minutes he smiled and said, "There should be. I have a lot of goals. A lot. His voice seemed to become soft. "When I was very young, my biggest goal was to be able to eat meat for every meal and let my grandfather drink wine for every meal. When I was a little older, I hoped that I could become strong quickly and walk out of the Li family's camp. When I was a little older, I began to pursue the invincible realm. I hoped to reach that realm as soon as possible because only when I reached that realm could I protect the Li family. When I walked out of the border and met Wang Tianzong, my goal was to be invincible in the world. I wanted to lead the Li family to surpass the previous peak and stand at the highest place." "Well," Li Tianlan smiled and said, "that's probably my goal now. Now I can be said to be invincible, but it's not absolute. And the Li family, we don't stand at the highest place." "Good goal." Xinyuan Wushang smiled, but there was no smile in his voice. "I mean, big brother, if you know that your goal is right in front of you, but you can't succeed no matter what, and you can only work in vain again and again, what will you do?" His voice was steady and soft. Li Tianlan raised his head and quietly looked at the little fat man in his sight. There was no expression on his chubby face, but there was a touch of sadness that couldn't be concealed in his eyes. It went deep into his bones. "I will persist." Li Tianlan was silent for a long time before he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Yes, persist." Xinyuan Wushang said softly, "We are also persisting. So, what's your goal?" Li Tianlan asked calmly. "Survival." Xinyuan Wushang smiled and said, "That's our biggest goal. Unfortunately, we're about to fail again." Chapter 1084. For the arrival of Li Tianlan and Dongqing Wudi, although the Qin family tried their best to hide something, they still inadvertently showed strong hostility and great fear. The Qin family's residence was not too far from the city center. It was a Chinese-style garden covering an area of less than 20 acres. It used to be the mansion of a prime minister of the previous dynasty, which matched Qin Fangqing's identity. It was said that Qin Fangqing fell in love with it at first sight. When he was the deputy prime minister, he brought his family here and built the prime minister's mansion into an antique but modern and comfortable yuan lin. About 7 years ago, the mansion was bought by Haoyue Group for 1.2 billion yuan. With such an area, the history of the mansion, and the fact that it was in Yuzhou, the price was not too high, but Yuzhou did not suffer a loss. Qin Fangqing's body was currently parked in the main hall of the mansion. When Li Tianlan and the others rushed over, a large number of people came out to greet them. What was rare was that except for Qin Fangqing, the other 8 directors were in Yuzhou. Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin were with Li Tianlan. The remaining 6, including Li Huaqing, all appeared in Li Tianlan's sight at this time. But the one walking in the center was not Li Huaqing. It was a middle-aged man in his early 40s. He looked a little like Qin Fangqing. He was slightly fat and wore a pair of glasses. At this time he was wearing morning clothes. His eyes were a little numb from the pain and he even looked a little sluggish. Obviously he had not reacted to the news of Qin Fangqing's sudden death. When shaking hands with Li Tianlan, his arm trembled violently. The almost numb pain seemed to become active the moment he saw Li Tianlan. The pain was changing, mixed with deep resentment and fear. At this moment he looked like he was going to pounce on Li Tianlan and bite him to death at any time. But in the end he dared not do anything. He even quietly lowered his head to hide his eyes. Li Tianlan glanced at him, narrowed his eyes and remained calm. He naturally knew the man in front of him. After Qin Fangqing he could basically be regarded as the pillar of the entire Qin family. This was Qin Fangqing's biological son and also Qin Fangqing's successor in Zhongzhou State, Qin Shi. A year ago he was just transferred to be the governor of Nanyun Province. This year he had just turned 38 years old. Standing in this position, it could be said that he had a bright future. Moreover, he was transferred to this position a year ago, which was enough to prove Qin Fangqing's good intentions. The election was only about a year away. After the election, whether Qin Fangqing retires or not, the major groups will adjust their existing personnel. Some people will be promoted, some people will be demoted, some people will leave and some people will stay. Before and after the election, it has always been a time of turbulence. Qin Shi was placed in the position of president a year ago. After the election, just after the red line of 2 years, the Prince Group can completely let Qin Shi take a step forward, leave Nanyun and become the speaker of a province. What was Qin Shi's position in the Prince Group? Judging from his age and position, it was obvious at a glance. Nowadays, Zhou Yuanshan, who was the focus of attention in the new group and was even considered to be very likely to become the president in 10 or 20 years, was 38 years old this year and served as the speaker of Jianghu province. In the southeast group, Wang Jingxin, who was almost as famous as Zhou Yuanshan, was 36 years old this year and served as the governor of Jianghu province. Qin Shi was 38 years old this year and served as the speaker of Nanyun province. If everything went well, then after the election, as soon as Qin Fangqing came down, or even before Qin Fangqing retired, Qin Shi's position would change again. Combined with the current personnel structure of the Prince Group, Qin Shi was likely to go to Tianfu province to serve as the speaker, embarking on the road to heaven that Qin Fangqing had walked before, from Tianfu to the southwest, entered the parliament, and finally competed with Zhou Yuanshan, Wang Jingxin, and others for the position of several directors. Zhou Yuanshan, Wang Jingxin, Qin Shi, for such people, if there were no major accidents, their path was destined to be smooth sailing. Perhaps there would be challenges, perhaps there would be setbacks, there would be ups and downs, but in the end they would all reach a dazzling position. What they were fighting for was only a matter of ranking. But now, the big accident really happened. If Qin Fangqing didn't die, even if he retired early, it wouldn't be a big problem. The Qin family might suffer heavy losses, Qin Fangqing's reputation might be ruined, but the Prince Group would certainly protect Qin Shi. His current position and qualifications were perfect. That was the perfection that the Prince Group had spent countless resources to pave. He was one of the core successors of the large group, and now he had reached the position of the provincial speaker, which meant that the internal management of the group couldn't give up on him, nor would they allow him to stumble, because the group didn't have enough time and resources to cultivate other successors. So as long as Qin Fangqing was still there, even if he didn't have any position, Qin Shi would be able to stabilize his position. 1 year later he would go to Tianfu and 6 years later he would enter the southwest, and the Qin family would once again restore its former glory. But Qin Fangqing died. Very suddenly, without the slightest sign, died inexplicably and left people at a loss. Qin Shi didn't believe that his father's death was an accident. He spoke to his father on the phone yesterday afternoon after receiving the news of the decisive battle in North Sea. At that time, Qin Fangqing's heart was suppressing great unwillingness and anger, but his attitude was still positive. He had always been in good health, how could he die in less than a day? Li Tianlan. It could only be Li Tianlan. It could only be the new group. Whether or not Qin Shi was rational enough, whether or not he could see that the new group's action at this time was extremely disadvantageous to their own situation, Qin Shi always believed that Li Tianlan killed his father. Because this was the only possible explanation. Since it was the only one, then no matter how absurd it was, the only one was the truth. The moment he saw Li Tianlan, Qin Shi's whole body suddenly fell into great hatred and rage, but when he saw Li Tianlan's eyes, all the hatred and rage seemed to be frozen. The other's eyes were calm and indifferent, like a basin of cold water without the slightest temperature, freezing all the blood in his body in an instant. Fear, coldness seeped in completely into his bone marrow. Only then did Qin Shi remember his identity. Or rather, he remembered his position. His position was the governor of Nanyun province. Nanyun province. Nanyun province was next to Tianan. The rapid development of Xinyuan City in the past 2 years was inseparable from the funds of Emperor Dong's palace and the support of the Flourishing Age Fund hidden behind the scenes at that time. But this was not all. Many plans needed to be discussed in the parliament. Among the large quantities of materials, some of them were strictly controlled. It was not that the Flourishing Age Fund and Emperor Dong's palace could not provide these things, but if they wanted to build a city with the plan of building a province first, they needed all kinds of materials, and they had to rely on the support of Zhongzhou state. All the materials had to pass through Nanyun province. And the materials for Xinyuan City were also prepared by Nanyun province first. For more than 2 years, the Prince Group and the academics kept chasing the Southeast Group and the Giant Group, and at the same time, they constantly put pressure on Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai. As the son of Qin Fangqing, Qin Shi sat in the unique position of Nanyun province. It was completely imaginable what his attitude towards Emperor Dong's palace and what he had done. At least, Qin Shi had secretly heard some rumors. More than one high-level official of Emperor Dong's palace had expressed their attitude that they would kill him sooner or later. At the very least, Qin Shi was on the blacklist of Emperor Dong's palace. If Qin Fangqing had not died, he would have become the master of Heaven's palace 1 year later. Naturally, he would not be afraid of this. But now Qin Fangqing suddenly died. At this moment, Qin Shi finally realized that his position as the successor of the group had been greatly shaken. There were 2 paths in front of him. One was negative and the other was positive. The negative response was naturally to do nothing, expect the counterattack of the group, expect Emperor Dong's palace to fall apart, or expect Li Tianlan to let the Qin family go under pressure. Strictly speaking, Li Tianlan did not have any hatred towards the Prince Group. The outcome of the game was at most a matter of gratitude and resentment, but not hatred. If he lost the game this time, he would naturally have a chance to get it back next time. All his killing intent was concentrated on Qin Fangqing. Today's plunder and suppression of the Prince Group, strictly speaking, had little to do with Li Tianlan's personal will, but the basic demand of the rise of the new group. This demand, in the analysis of many people, could overwhelm everything. Qin Fangqing's death undoubtedly put great pressure on Li Tianlan. Perhaps under pressure for the sake of the new group, he might not do anything to the Qin family. In this way, through the most difficult period, Qin Shi thought that he could rely on his father's death to regain his footing. On this path, the only thing he could expect was that Li Tianlan would let the Qin family go because of the excessive pressure. The positive path was the complete opposite. That was to use the news of his father's death to exert his influence to the extreme and run around. Now the Prince Group was like a powder keg that would explode at the slightest touch. Everyone had a fire in their hearts that they had nowhere to vent. If he came forward, he was 90% sure that he could completely unite the majority of the forces of the Prince Group in the shortest time. This force might not be led by him, but it was definitely aimed at Li Tianlan. This was also the situation that the academics hoped to see. Once he did this, the academics would respond to his actions as soon as possible. At that time, the Special Warfare Group and the Southeast Group might join in. They would target Dongqing Wudi, Li Tianlan, and the group behind them and make them make all kinds of compromises. It was easy to succeed on this path. And the so-called success was just to make Li Tianlan compromise. Qin Shi was not sure how far he could make Li Tianlan compromise and not target the Qin family. And once he did so, as the source of all things, the Qin family would inevitably incur stronger hatred from the whole Emperor Dong's palace. This also meant that on this path, he would directly stand at the forefront, on the opposite side of the young Emperor Dong, and directly challenge his majesty. Yes, it was majesty. Qin Shi felt that it was not too much to use this word to describe Li Tianlan. In the eyes of many, he was the heavenly son. In the eyes of certain people, he was a child. In the eyes of Qin Weibai, he was her husband. In the eyes of the people of Emperor Dong's palace, he was his majesty. But in the eyes of all the enemies of Li Tianlan today, the current Li Tianlan was invincible. Invincible in the world, naturally, his majesty was irresistible. Qin Shi wanted to take this path, but he had asked himself countless times, and he still did not feel that he had the courage to stand in front of Li Tianlan. Moreover, even if he really did so, Qin Shi was not sure how many people would speak up for him if Li Tianlan insisted on destroying the Qin family, even if he compromised on a lot of things. As long as Li Tianlan was willing to compromise and give up some resources, then the Prince Group would have the possibility to choose a new successor. Although it was only a possibility and not an opportunity, it was better than nothing. Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace had grown to this extent. For the Prince Group, naturally they wanted to get rid of them as soon as possible. But for the Southeast Group and the academics, They were happy to suppress the new group in Emperor Dong's palace, but if they wanted to destroy Emperor Dong's palace and the new group, these two groups would definitely retreat faster than anyone else. Therefore, Li Tianlan would always have a position at the top of Jianghu state. Many people would suppress him. Li Tianlan would also compromise, but no matter how he compromised, he had to find a target to vent his anger. At that time, when everything was settled, the Qin family would undoubtedly be the most suitable target to be sacrificed. And such a thing was also the most likely. Qin Shi did not dare to do so. But if he continued to wait passively, what would happen after Li Tianlan passed the most difficult period? At that time, the strength of the Prince Group would be greatly damaged. Qin Shi was one of the successors of the Prince Group, but not the only one. With the scale of the Prince Group, it was enough to train 2 future directors of Jianghu state, and Qin Shi was just one of them. Just one of them. When the strength of the Prince Group was greatly damaged in a short time, it was impossible for them to replace both successors. Therefore, giving up one and fully supporting the other was the most rational behavior. Qin Shi would also be given up. Just before and after the election. He would also leave Nanyun. But instead of going to Qianfu, he would go to Yuzhou and be given an idle position. After a few years, when no one paid attention to him, Emperor Dong's palace would also attack him. Qin Shi suddenly found that he had no choice. No matter what choice he made, the Qin family seemed to be facing a dead end. Resentment, unwillingness, fear, coldness, all the emotions turned into a huge pressure, crushing Qin Shi's spine. He held Li Tianlan's hand stiffly, and he did not realize that he had bent down. And in his eyes, there was also a flash of hatred. A vague voice sounded in his ear. It was Li Tianlan's voice, faint, without any emotion, no apparent pain, no apparent pleasure. I'm sorry for the whole Jianghu state, the death of the Prime Minister is a huge loss. The voice became more and more vague. Qin Shi could not hear it clearly. He held Li Tianlan's hand and his body shook. At noon in the sky full of snow, his body fell heavily to the ground. Call an ambulance, someone fainted. The Qin family was in a mess and some staff began to make calls. In the noisy atmosphere, Li Tianlan shook hands with everyone in the Qin family in turn. He was expressionless. No one in the Qin family had the courage to look into his eyes. Li Tianlan shook hands with everyone in the Qin family coldly, expressing his condolences. Li Huaqing and other counselors just watched quietly. To some extent, such condolences were a demonstration. Li Huaqing and Hua Xingyang kept their composure. On the side, Guo Wentian's eyes flashed with a blazing and angry light. Zhou Yunhai kept his composure. Wan Qingyun and Ji Wenjiang's eyes flickered, and no one knew what they were thinking. Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin walked in front of Li Tianlan calmly, as if they did not notice Li Tianlan's posture behind them. Until he shook hands with a nephew of Chen Fangqing, Li Tianlan casually shook his hand. A few sword intents rose out of thin air and froze into ice in Li Tianlan's hand. The water drops had been evaporated by the high temperature before they fell from his hand. This blatant action of washing hands embarrassed everyone in the Chen family to the extreme. All the counselors were watching this scene and no one spoke. They all knew what Li Tianlan's action meant. This was tantamount to telling them a problem. The Chen family's business was not over. Was this an expression of determination? Li Huaqing sighed in his heart, looked at Li Tianlan who walked in front of him and reached out to shake hands with him. It's too sudden. Li Tianlan said. Yes, no one was prepared. The Prime Minister has always been very healthy. I just checked the data records of the healthcare doctor for the past 6 months. The Prime Minister's blood pressure has only been slightly high in recent months. Who knows? Li Huaqing shook his head and his eyes were a little complicated. Is this an accident? Li Tianlan looked into Li Huaqing's eyes and asked. Li Huaqing paused slightly and did not speak. This question was too direct. If he said it was not an accident, that meant that he thought Chen Fangqing's death was a murder. If he said it was an accident, that meant that in his attitude this matter had nothing to do with Li Tianlan. No matter what he said, it was not appropriate for Li Huaqing. The forensic doctor is still studying, and it's not clear at the moment. Li Huaqing said vaguely. Li Tianlan nodded. Where is the Prime Minister's body? I also brought a doctor, maybe he can draw some conclusions. Oh. Li Huaqing glanced at Li Tianlan with some playfulness. It's not against the law to look at the body, is it? Li Tianlan said faintly and waved his hand. Shenyuan Wuxiang, who was walking at the back, slightly quickened his pace and stood beside Li Tianlan. Li Huaqing hesitated and nodded. Follow me. Li Huaqing said yes, said goodbye to the other directors and went directly to the main hall. Chen Fangqing's body was lying on a bed, covered all over. Xinyuan Wushang glanced at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan nodded. Xinyuan Wushang took 2 steps forward and casually lifted the cover on the body. Qin Fangqing's eyes were closed and he looked very peaceful. If you didn't look at the color of his skin, he looked like he was asleep. With his back to Li Tianlan and Li Huaqing, Xinyuan Wushang narrowed his eyes. There was an incomparably pure light flowing in his eyes, as if he had seen through everything. The light in his eyes became brighter and brighter. His pupils slowly narrowed, but the expression on his face began to become doubtful. The doubt slowly became dignified and serious, and finally turned into a touch of fear and dread. He stared at Qin Fangqing for almost 5 minutes. He put down the cover again. "How is it?" Li Tianlan, who had been standing there chatting with Li Huaqing and couldn't do anything else, asked casually. "Nothing unexpected." Xinyuan Wushang was silent for a long time, and then slowly said, "It's a natural death." No one could see his expression. Obviously this was not the truth. But this was the only thing Xinyuan Wushang could know. From Qin Fangqing's body he could vaguely feel that something was wrong. This feeling was vague, but his instinct told him that such a death was definitely not a normal death. But the problem was, Xinyuan Wushang knew that it was not a normal death, but he didn't know how abnormal it was. He didn't know at all. Chapter 1085. No one believed Xinyuan Wushang's words. Just like the forensic doctor's conclusion that Qin Fangqing died of natural causes, no one believed it either. Such a death was too coincidental, and there were great benefits behind such a coincidence. So even if it was a natural death, some people tried to turn it into a conspiracy. Xinyuan Wushang was a doctor, but he was unknown and had no authority to prove it. In the eyes of others, his so-called natural death was just a formality that Li Tianlan had brought a person here to go through the motions and give the conclusion of natural death. People didn't even believe that Xinyuan Wushang was a doctor. This conclusion couldn't stand scrutiny and no one would believe it at all. But at the very least, Li Tianlan had to show his attitude. As the new group became more and more clear, and people kept changing their positions under the influence of the Flourishing Age Fund, Li Tianlan's attitude could be said to be unimportant, but it could also be said to be very important. But on the scene no one showed any doubt about Xinyuan Wushang, even those from the Qin family. There was an endless stream of people from the Qin family who came to mourn. After all, he was the prime minister of a country. No matter how down and out he was, ordinary people couldn't compare with him. And now most of the people who could get the news were well informed. They could know about Qin Fangqing's death, and naturally they could see some possible developments after Qin Fangqing's death. At this time, no one wanted to offend Li Tianlan, and naturally no one wanted to offend Qin Fangqing. Anyway, it was just a trip and no one thought it was troublesome. On such an occasion, other directors of Jianghu state had to show up, but it was not suitable for them to be watched for a long time. So Li Huaqing took the initiative to borrow a side hall from the Chen family and prepared to hold a temporary meeting on the spot. When talking to the Chen family, Li Huaqing's expression and voice were very calm. But Li Tianlan, Dongqing Wudi, and Zhou Mulin all took a deep look at him. Meeting in the Qin family. Everyone knew what it meant. The Qin family was not far from the Hidden Dragon Sea. Under normal circumstances, even if there was a meeting, it should be held in the Hidden Dragon Sea. In fact, they had nothing else to do here. There was no need to stay here after showing up. Qin Fangqing's death was sudden and special. In the past 100 years, he was the first director to pass away before he even retired. Therefore, all the counselors would show up. All the counselors in Yuzhou and the powerhouses of the military headquarters would come here. In the next 3 days, all the counselors in Jianghu state would come to Yuzhou and wait for Qin Fangqing's funeral. If Qin Fangqing had already retired, the directors would also come before the official funeral. However, they would not appear at the same time. In fact, not all of them would appear. They would ask the secretary to help maintain the order at the scene. They would only attend the funeral ceremony for Qin Fangqing's remains. So, strictly speaking, after the appearance, all the directors had nothing to do. It was enough to leave 2 secretaries to assist the Qin family. They could come again during the funeral ceremony 3 days later. But now, Li Huaqing requested to have a meeting at the Qin family. Was it because the meeting was so urgent that they couldn't even make it from here to the Hidden Dragon Sea, which was less than 20 kilometers away? That was obviously not the case. This was gaining the upper hand by a show of strength. The high-level meeting held in the Qin family had a rich meaning, and the most direct meaning was Li Huaqing's dissatisfaction with Li Tianlan. Holding the meeting here not only put great pressure on Li Tianlan and the giant group, but also showed his attitude to other groups. Li Tianlan was expressionless and didn't say anything from beginning to end. The Chen family specially arranged a relatively quiet room in the backyard for Chen Fangqing. The room was not very big, so it seemed extremely crowded after the high-level people walked in. There were still a lot of people present today. Not only the 9 counselors but also the 3 deputy prime ministers of the cabinet, 2 national advisors, Speaker of Yuzhou by Zhanfeng, 4 deputy ministers of the military headquarters by Qing Zhao, the deputy secretary general and the counselors of the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Personnel, the Coalition Ministry and other departments were all present. Li Huaqing sat in the main seat and silently looked at everyone present. Li Tianlan sat opposite Li Huaqing with a blank face. He didn't say a word and his mind was wandering. I just met the Prime Minister yesterday. Li Huaqing was silent for about 5 minutes before he slowly said, "We talked until late. Last night he was still discussing the development of Jianghu state with me. Who could have thought that today?" There was an extremely sincere regret and sigh in his tone. No one knew what he really thought. Guo Wentian took out a cigarette and lit it. He said slowly, "We've been communicating a lot recently. The Prime Minister has been under a lot of pressure recently and often suffers from insomnia. His headache is an old problem and he's talked to the doctor about it, but the doctor didn't have a good solution. He just prescribed some painkillers and told him to rest well." Guo Wentian laughed at himself and said, "Pay attention to rest. As far as I know, the Prime Minister's work and rest have been extremely chaotic in recent years, and a lot of things have happened recently. How can he have any rest?" There was silence. The Prime Minister has always been very concerned about the affairs of the cabinet. The Prime Minister's vision has always been very long-term. He pays attention to the future of the cabinet. At the same time, he often reflects on the past of the cabinet, combines the past with the present, summarizes the experience and explores the future road. A few days ago the Prime Minister mentioned to me that the future of the cabinet still needs new ideas, a new atmosphere and 100 schools of thought contend. Many years ago we vigorously supported agriculture and later we vigorously supported industry. These correct measures have established our position in the world today. In recent years our eyes have been locked on finance and energy. For other fields, there has been a certain neglect, so we have also missed some opportunities. So the Prime Minister feels that after the election, we should promote some talents from various aspects and enrich the breadth of thinking of the cabinet. He said that no field of the country should be abandoned. A cabinet member suddenly said in a calm and unhurried tone. Li Tianlan raised his eyelids and glanced at him, but still did not speak. The speaker was He Jingnan, a cabinet member who had been very low-key in recent years. The so-called cabinet member was theoretically at the same level as the deputy prime minister, but in fact he had great influence but did not compete for the position of deputy prime minister. Strong people had real power in their hands and they also had their own fields. But most of the time they cooperated with the work of the cabinet. In other words, they cooperated with the work of the real master of the cabinet. A few years ago, He Jingnan had been in a state of semi-retirement. After this election he was bound to retire. No one thought that in this matter he would rush out after Guo Wentian to be the vanguard. He Jingnan felt Li Tianlan's gaze and nodded to him, smiling politely and respectfully. He was the backbone of the Prince Group, but he could not be regarded as one of the core members. However, Qin Fangqing died suddenly. In today's Yuzhou he was already a relatively important figure that Guo Wentian could pull out, and Guo Wentian also gave him an offer that he could not refuse. Originally, He Jingnan did not intend to express his position in this matter. The fields he was in charge of overlapped with Wu Jingmin's in many places. In other words, he worked with Wu Jingmin in the cabinet. After Wu Jingmin entered the cabinet, he quickly straightened out the relationship. After experiencing the means of this old fox who had carried the flag for the Li family for more than 20 years, He Jingnan chose to give in. Although he was still in office, he did not have much time to show up in the cabinet. In theory, the situation and rise and fall of the major groups in Jianghu state had little to do with him. But his son was now in a critical period. His son was now the mayor of East Mountain Province's Kojima city. Kojima was a vice-governor level city, but the mayor of Kojima was a vice-governor level city. Although it couldn't be said to be low in status, it wasn't too high either. Guo Wentian almost hit his soft spot as soon as he opened his mouth. If this operation was successful, after the election, his son would be transferred to the capital city of Tianfu province to serve as a member of the council and the speaker of the capital city. In this position, if everything went well, it was very likely that he would become the governor of Tianfu province in a single step after 5 years. That was the real core member of the Prince Group. At his age, his son had little chance to become a director, and the prince group did not have such resources. But starting from the position of the governor of Tianfu province, as long as he was not too unlucky, his son could basically reach his current height. Whether he became a member of parliament or a member of the cabinet, he could ensure the continued glory of the family. Therefore He Jingnan did not hesitate. He just thought for a few seconds and then promised Guo Wenyan that he would fight for him at the meeting. What he said through Qin Fangqing's mouth was very implicit, but everyone was very clear about what he meant. Promote talents from various aspects and perspectives. The sentence was the key of the key. The so-called various aspects and perspectives could be understood as focusing on officials with different talents. But there was no shortage of such different types of officials in the major groups. Even the weakest North group had a lot of them. So this sentence was equivalent to saying that the cabinet after the election was a piece of cake placed in front of the major groups, and everyone had a chance to share a piece. In other words, the next cabinet would no longer be a group with a relative advantage. Instead, every group could make their own voices heard in different positions. This had an absolute conflict of fundamental interests with the future planning of the new group. Wu Jingmin became the second minister. Bai Qingqian became the deputy minister. The goal of the new group was clear and clear. It put its two leaders in the cabinet, and even sacrificed a lot of possible local interests for this. The first step of the rise of the new group was to win the right to speak in the cabinet. Now He Jingnan wanted to let the cabinet compete. All the people of the group entered the cabinet, which also meant that the position of the new group in the cabinet would be greatly reduced, and its right to speak would also be greatly weakened. The strategy of the new group would completely fail. At that time, even if Wu Jingmin and Bai Qingqian were pushed up, the new group would only get a small number of positions in a few provinces, and its foundation would become unstable. It was hard to say what the future of such a new group would be, but at least it would be difficult to start. The cabinet's competition was the first step of the prince group's plan. In this plan, because there were too many voices from all sides, the authority of the second minister would be weakened to a certain extent, and the main authority would be concentrated on the prime minister. Many contradictions and conflicts needed to be mediated by the prime minister who controlled the cabinet, which further accelerated the speed at which the new prime minister accumulated prestige in the cabinet. The second step of the plan was taken over by the academics. They tried their best to push Hua Jingyang to the position of prime minister, put pressure on the new group and curb his speed of development. The academics would fully support the first step of the prince group's plan. The prince group would fully support the second step of the academics' plan. The tacit understanding could be said to be flawless. In order to win more support, the prospect of the cabinet's competition was explained in advance, which was to rope in other groups. The cabinet was the core of the country. Each department under the cabinet meant great power, especially the departments of finance, development, security, commerce, agriculture, and industry. Not to mention the position of minister, even the deputy or even the head of some important departments and bureaus, would be fought over. When these positions were held in the hands of the major groups, they would also become some stable promotion ladder, and they were the kind with great value. Such positions, no matter how many there were, no one would complain. Since He Jingnan had said this on behalf of the prince group, it was equivalent to a promise from the prince group in the academics. Such a promise couldn't be stingy. After all, the major groups had their own dealings and it wasn't a one-time deal. If their reputation was ruined this time, even if it was beneficial in the short term, it wouldn't be worth it in the long term. Therefore, in order to get the leadership of the cabinet, the prince group and the academics really planned to divide a considerable part of the cabinet's power. While roping in other groups, they suppressed the new group's plan to conquer the cabinet. Could be said to be killing two birds with one stone. Personally, I think the prime minister's words make sense. He Jingnan looked at Li Tianlan and immediately shifted his gaze. He wasn't too afraid of Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan did bring a lot of pressure to people, but no matter how arrogant Li Tianlan was, he wouldn't go so far as to kill his entire family just because of a few words. Everyone present knew this very well. Therefore he continued to speak, expressing his attitude, "It's simply a penetrating insight. I also hope to see a cabinet with diverse thinking. The death of the prime minister is a huge loss to Jianghu state, but we should unswervingly follow his path. Time will prove that he and we are both right." "That is to say I'm wrong?" Li Tianlan suddenly asked. His eyes fell on He Jingnan, his eyes bright and unblinking. In fact, no one mentioned anything about him, but Li Tianlan just took it personally. No one thought he was stupid. He just sat there quietly, but as he spoke, everyone could clearly feel a kind of incomparably cold and stiff pressure. He Jingnan moved his mouth and was about to speak. Li Tianlan suddenly said, have you really seen the Prime Minister recently? He Jingnan was dumbfounded. Everyone's eyes shifted to him. At this juncture He Jingnan could not take half a step back no matter what. He braced himself and nodded, saying naturally, Of course. Of course. I don't believe it. Li Tianlan said lightly, I don't believe the Prime Minister would say this to a dispensable cabinet member like you. It's not essential. This was an understatement, but in He Jingnan's ears, it had the effect of killing people. He Jingnan's face suddenly turned red. But before he could explode in anger, Li Tianlan had already continued, I will send someone to investigate this matter. Your specific whereabouts these days will soon be investigated. Here, today you can say whatever you want, even in the name of the Prime Minister. But today everyone is sitting here. If you haven't seen the Prime Minister, it is tantamount to deceiving the entire Jianghu state. At that time, even if Jianghu state does not touch you, I will make you pay the price. He Jingnan's body stiffened. His snow-white beard trembled and his face was a little pale. Your Majesty is really domineering. Hua Jingyang suddenly said with sarcasm. Li Tianlan glanced at him. Whether it was He Jingnan or the Prince Group, they were important, but they weren't absolutely important. Everyone knew that whether the new group could conquer the cabinet or not had a direct and absolute relationship with whether Hua Jingyang could become the new Prime Minister. He was the biggest obstacle on the way to the rise of the new group. I don't want to be deceived, especially in the name of a dead man. Everyone is very clear about the Prime Minister's character. He distinguishes between merits and demerits. No one will deny what he has done. Such a person should be respected enough. But if someone uses his death to seek benefits for themselves, then where does the Prime Minister stand? Where does the cabinet stand? I will investigate it clearly and make some people pay the price. I do this to be responsible for Jianghu state. Li Tianlan's voice was cold and tough. The conversation seemed to be at an impasse. Li Huaqing silently watched the other people in the room without batting an eyelid. Hua Jingyang's eyebrows twitched slightly. He wanted to say something but he held back. Li Tianlan's words were equivalent to the most naked threat. He was not only threatening He Jingnan. It was also Hua Jingyang. He Jingnan spoke in the name of Chen Fangqing. Li Tianlan used Jianghu state to fight back. Be responsible for Jianghu state. Li Tianlan was already qualified to say this. No one present, including Li Huaqing, dared to say to Li Tianlan that Jianghu state did not need his responsibility. No one dared to say it, and no one could bear such a responsibility. So this extremely tough threat meant that Li Tianlan had forced the academics to the brink of falling out with him. Falling out completely? This was definitely not what Li Huaqing wanted to see. In the silence, Li Tianlan slowly tapped on the table in front of him. His fingers jumped rhythmically on the table and the other hand supported his face. He tilted his body and looked at He Jingnan. Now I will give you another chance. Tell me, have you seen the Prime Minister recently? He Jingnan's body trembled obviously. He wanted to speak but he lost all his courage for a moment. Li Huaqing frowned and suddenly said, Okay, we can discuss this matter later. Let's go back to Hidden Dragon Sea and hold a formal meeting. He paused and said calmly, Huayang, you stay and see if there is anything else the Qin family needs. The Prime Minister left suddenly. You have to temporarily take charge of the work of the cabinet so that he can leave at ease. Temporarily arrest him? Was this temporarily really temporary or? Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and showed a sneer. Li Huaqing, did you want to set the tone directly? Ji Wenjiang and Wan Qingyun also raised their heads at the same time, looked at each other and wanted to speak. But Li Tianlan had already beaten them to it. I'm different. He didn't finish his words either. It was because at the instant he spoke, cries of grief suddenly sounded from within the Qin clan. Wails of despair and misery filled the air. Such a sound was very common in the news of Chen Fangqing's death. However, the voice that had suddenly appeared seemed to have been magnified thousands of times in an instant. Li Tianlan was stunned. The next moment, the door of the temporary meeting room was suddenly pushed open. Li Huaqing's secretary Ma Si rushed in a panic. Behind Ma Si, the secretary of Hua Jingyang and Wu Jingmin also rushed in. President, everyone. Ma Si's breathing was a little short and his face was extremely ugly. When he spoke, he subconsciously looked at Li Tianlan, with a touch of fear in his eyes, avoiding eye contact. Li Tianlan's heart sank for no reason. Ma Si's voice was like an icy wind, blowing quickly through the meeting room and into everyone's heart. Just 2 minutes ago in the ambulance. Ma Si said in a dry voice, Governor Qin, she passed away, the cause of death. Cerebral hemorrhage. There was a dead silence. Li Tianlan's body stiffened in place. His face became completely livid. Chapter 1086. The crowd hurried, and the huge mansion of the Qin family was completely shrouded in a desperate and tragic atmosphere. The male relatives of the Qin family could barely support their bodies to receive the guests, but the women had completely lost their souls. There was no more sorrow, no more crying. Everyone sat in the morning hall in a daze, like puppets placed in the morning hall. A brand new morning hall belonging to Qin Shi was quickly set up. The number of people who came to the Qin family increased in less than 2 hours after Qin Shi's death. The news of the death of the father and son of the Qin family spread from the temporary conference room. The resolution had been formed, the documents were sent to various places, and the major media software pushed the news at the same time. At this time, almost all of Jianghu state had known that the prime minister and Qin Shi died on the same day. Li Tianlan was still the biggest suspect. Qin Fangqing's death shocked people and Li Tianlan's madness. But Qin Shi's death made almost everyone angry. It was too much. Everyone felt the same way. Li Tianlan was challenging the most basic bottom line that the whole Jianghu state had formed for hundreds of years. Killing the prime minister, killing the governor. If he could get through this safely, who would he not dare to kill in the future? Status was meaningless, position was meaningless, power was meaningless, and everyone in the whole Jianghu state would be shrouded in the shadow of Emperor Dong's palace. Would such a Jianghu state still be Jianghu state? Not anymore. The answer was yes. Not anymore. Such a Jianghu state was a cage. Perhaps no one would sympathize with Qin Fangqing and Qin Shi, but when they got the news, countless people started to unite and began to resist Li Tianlan. Power and the privileged class were unpopular in the eyes of most people, but they must exist. This was the most stable part of the order. Such stability was magnified to some extent, and became one of the sources of social stability. When the so-called privilege and power were killed by people who ignored the rules, regardless of the impact, such people became lunatics in the eyes of everyone. A lunatic who must die. The news of the death of the father and son of the Qin family was like a thunder, arousing endless killing intent and hostility. The most obvious and the first thing to show was the number of people who came to the Qin family to offer their condolences. The deputy speaker of Yuzhou province arrived first. Nobody thought too much about the deputy speaker who had the background of Special Warfare Group. Closely after that, the deputy mayor of Yuzhou province, the director of the development committee and the deputy minister of the Ministry of Personnel arrived. Everybody sensed something unusual. The patriarchs of the rich and powerful families brought their core members to pay a visit. Some of these patriarchs were close to the Prince group, some to the North group and some to the Giant group. But all of them came. They remained silent, expressing their support for the Qin family in silence. The meeting in the temporary conference room continued. Li Huaqing, who had originally planned to move the venue, once again chose to continue the meeting after hearing the news of Qin Shi's death. Li Tianlan did not come out again. But everyone could imagine how fiercely Li Tianlan, even Dongqing Wudi, Wu Jingmin, and the others were suffering now. The meeting had been going on for nearly 5 hours. The sky had already darkened and night had fallen. The mansion of the Qin family was bustling. A large number of officials gathered here. After coming here, except for those who had urgent matters, they were not in a hurry to leave. Even if a few left, they left their secretaries here. More and more people came to the Qin family. After dinner, these people still gathered in 2s and 3s, occasionally glancing at a certain corner. In that corner, the chubby Xianyuan Wuxiang, who did not look aggressive at all, was sitting there silently, with a cup of cold tea in front of him. Xianyuan Wuxiang's expression was even gloomier than Li Tianlan's. Every few seconds, the gazes from every corner would sweep past him, intentionally or unintentionally, with disgust that they wanted to hide but couldn't. Xianyuan Wuxiang knew very well that this disgust was because he came with Li Tianlan, and people all knew that he was Li Tianlan's driver. If they treated him like this, how much would they feel about Li Tianlan now? These people discussed Li Tianlan. As time passed, almost the entire Jianghu state hated Emperor Dong's palace. It was said that several counselors from other places had now arrived in Yuzhou and were on their way to the Qin family. Obviously, the meeting that had lasted for several hours was no longer an impromptu meeting. Qin Fangqing and even all the high-level members of the council were really angry, and they planned to discuss a clear result today. Xianyuan Wuxiang did not want to think about what such a result would be, but he was very clear about it. He knew that this time he was in big trouble. If Qin Fangqing's death was a huge trouble for Li Tianlan, then with Qin Shi's death on the same day, this trouble had now evolved into a near-fatal crisis in just a few hours. To Li Tianlan, Emperor Dong's palace and the Giant group. If this matter was confirmed, then it was no longer a question of how the strength of the new group would shrink. It was no exaggeration to say that this was a question of whether Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace could continue to exist. No, this was no longer a question. Because Jianghu state could not allow such a thing to exist. And such a thing did not even need to be confirmed. The current situation was that everyone was suspecting Li Tianlan. When everyone thought it was Li Tianlan who did it, then it didn't matter who the real culprit was. Jianghu state's patience had obviously reached its limit. Xinyuan Wuxiang didn't know how much time he had left. Maybe 1 day, maybe 3 days, maybe a week, but no more than half a month. During this period, if Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace could not come up with enough evidence to prove their innocence, then the entire Emperor Dong's palace would be completely destroyed, and Jianghu state would do everything to kill Li Tianlan. Without any hesitation, without any apprehension, at all costs. As long as Jianghu state made up its mind, Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace must die. This was a fact that did not need to be stated. It was very simple. If Li Tianlan was alive, then every high-level official in Jianghu state would face the irresistible threat of death. Therefore, the capital of a nation Yuandu would be fully used to kill Li Tianlan and erase everything related to him. Poison gas, bombing, surprise attack, assassination, seduction, even war, even nuclear war. Emperor Dong's palace did not have nuclear weapons, and their biggest deterrent was Li Tianlan himself. When Jianghu state made up its mind to eradicate Li Tianlan, they would not hesitate to take out all their trump cards. Li Tianlan was very destructive. Then they would surround him with a crowd. 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, 1 million, 2 million. The army was endless and all kinds of high-tech weapons emerged one after another. This was not an exaggeration. If Li Tianlan could not prove his innocence, Jianghu state would inevitably do so. As long as there were people alive in Jianghu state, they would do so. At that time, the so-called new group would become a joke, Emperor Dong's palace would become ruins, and Li Tianlan would inevitably die. This was something that needed no doubt. And with Li Tianlan's death, the entire giant group would also embark on the old road that once happened in another miracle city. Dongqing Wudi by Qingqian Zhou Yuanshan, Dongqing Qiuqi by Zhanfang by Qingzhou, everyone would be liquidated. Xinyuan Wuxiang took a deep breath. Compared with the urgency of the situation, he felt more humiliated. He could feel that something was wrong with Chen Fangqing's inexplicable death. But after thinking about it for an afternoon, he had no idea what was wrong or how to prove it. As for Qin Shi, he once wanted to get close to Qin Shi's body, but he was stopped by all the Qin family members with red eyes. The situation was already very dangerous. In this situation, if Jianghu state attacked Li Tianlan fiercely enough, maybe by tomorrow Wu Jingmin or Dongqing Wudi would take the blame and resign. And this was just the prelude to the decline of the giant group in Emperor Dong's palace. Xianyuan Wuxiang suddenly stood up. He walked to a corner, took out his mobile phone and dialed a number. The phone rang twice and was quickly connected. Xing Tian's steady and heavy voice sounded on the other end of the phone. Your Highness. How did Qin Shi die? Xianyuan Wuxiang asked. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. 2 seconds later, Xing Tian's heavy voice sounded, I don't know. Then changed from not knowing to knowing. I want the information of the mastermind, even a clue. Xianyuan Wuxiang's voice was extremely cold and ruthless. If necessary, you can die. Okay. Xing Tian's voice was simple and honest, without any hesitation. Xianyuan Wuxiang paused and continued, and don't investigate the cause of Chen Fangqing's death. Xing Tian was a little confused. Chen Fangqing's death makes me feel very uneasy. I don't know why, but when I look at his body I feel fear. I can't see Qin Shi's body now. I just looked at it from a distance. That feeling doesn't make me feel uneasy, but it makes me very annoyed, very annoyed. Xing Tian was silent for a while and said softly, I'll start investigating now. Xianyuan Wuxiang said that he could die if necessary, but from his words, Xing Tian clearly sensed something different. Because Xianyuan Wuxiang felt different. This feeling was worth relying on. The different feeling meant that the people who killed Qin Shi and Chen Fangqing might not be the same group of people. If he investigated the cause of Chen Fangqing's death, he might die instantly. But investigating Qin Shi might not be the case. Xing Tian silently hung up the phone. The wind and snow were still blowing outside the window of Yuzhou. It had been snowing for a day, and the whole of Yuzhou was covered in a cold, silvery white. Xing Tian stood in front of the window for a while, then slowly turned around and sat on the sofa. His huge body seemed to have become absolutely quiet the moment he sat down. Breathing, heartbeat, Everything became inaudible. Xing Tian reached out and grabbed something in the air. The air twisted in his hand and finally turned into an incorporeal brush in his palm. He grabbed again with his other hand. The air seemed to have been pulled down by him, making a crisp sound. It sounded like he was tearing off a piece of paper with a slight force. The air with some irregular edges was casually placed on the table. Xing Tian held the incorporeal brush and stared at the incorporeal paper on the table. He was a calligrapher. In this field, he had the ability to see some things clearly. For example, the cause of Chen Shi's death. Xing Tian slowly put the brush down and slowly drew a line on the incorporeal paper. The incorporeal tip of the brush swept across the incorporeal paper, leaving a light red line. Xing Tian thought for a while and wrote 2 words on the paper. 6 years. Before he finished writing the 2 words, the incorporeal red line disappeared. Xing Tian was stunned. He knew that the starting point he was looking for was Li Tianlan, but Li Tianlan couldn't be the starting point. He drew another line and wrote down 2.5 years. The light red line appeared steadily on the paper. The tip of the brush began to tremble. Xing Tian wrote a line. Qi Mulan died. In the blink of an eye, countless densely packed words suddenly covered the empty piece of paper. Before Xing Tian had time to take a look, the handwriting disappeared completely. Xing Tian was a little depressed, but he had to try another way. He took the brush and didn't plan the time. Instead, he randomly found a starting point and wrote, "I ate 5 caddies of rice last night." Countless versions of himself began to emerge. It was like countless options neatly arranged. The rice came from Thailand. The rice came from Jianghu State. The rice came from... Countless places appeared in front of Xing Tian. The option of the rice came from Jianghu State glowed red. Xing Tian clicked on the option that glowed red and wrote another sentence. "It tastes good." The dense handwriting seemed to be Xing Tian's thoughts that had been imprinted. Xing Tian's whole person became completely quiet. When everything went smoothly, under his control, the brush in his hand quickly continued to write. At this moment, his huge body began to fade slowly. The light in the room dimmed. His figure became fainter and fainter and finally became a shadow. The shadow was still constantly thinning, and finally became a shadow without a head. And the shadow without a head kept writing something on the paper. His writing speed was even more exaggerated than a computer-generated file. In the blink of an eye, dense handwriting had appeared in front of him. Xing Tian entered the real state of unconsciousness. On the incorporeal paper, the content appeared chaotically and clearly. "I ate 5 caddies of rice last night and it tasted good. His Majesty attached great importance to us, so he informed the kitchen to buy more of this kind of rice. The origin of the rice came from Longjiang, Jianghu State, and the kitchen stock was running out. The kitchen supervisor went to the supermarket in Shenyuan City to buy and encountered a small car accident on the way. His Majesty took us to Yuzhou. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel was very luxurious. The front desk lady did not look very good. His Majesty and His Highness entered the Hidden Dragon Sea. Chen Fangqing's spirit was in an extremely unstable state. Xing Tian was still writing, but the content had become a wavy line. Xing Tian himself did not notice this scene. The content of the handwriting continued. Chen Fangqing saw Wu Jingmin. His consciousness was chaotic, and his spirit was in a relaxed state. The 2 majesties arrived at the hotel smoothly and received the room card from the front desk lady on duty. The front desk lady was in a very bad mood. Her father was a truck driver who worked in Nanyuan all year round, responsible for transporting supplies from Nanyuan to Ningbian and Shenyuan City. But her father had a car accident in Shenyuan City today. She had a deep hostility to the 2 majesties from Tianan. A young man came to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and saw the front desk lady on duty. Xing Tian's handwriting suddenly paused. Bang! In the slight sound, the brush in his hand and the paper in the void instantly exploded. Xing Tian, who had become a phantom, instantly turned into a huge corpse. A mouthful of blood sprayed directly from his mouth. He opened his eyes. His eyes flickered with a touch of shock. He was originally calculating the cause of Chen Shi's death, but after entering the real state he was cleverly misled. The direction of his investigation seemed to point to Chen Fangqing. There was a touch of shock in Xing Tian's eyes. The blown-up paper was pieced together in front of him. He looked at the words that had been written and frowned. It was not because there were too many words on it, but because there were too few words. There was a very interesting saying in the Miracle City that a butterfly in the tropical rainforest of the Amazon River in South America could cause a tornado in Texas 2 weeks later with an occasional flap of its wings. This was the very famous butterfly effect. This was a strange chaotic phenomenon, but it was limited to one system. Xing Tian was a calligrapher, and his ability was more comprehensive. He could cross multiple systems in all directions. Starting from a small thing, it formed a huge chain reaction. There were countless explanations to explain the cause of Qin Fangqing's death from this aspect. Now there were billions of people on the earth, so there might be billions of explanations for Qin Fangqing's death. These explanations were correct to a certain extent, but not completely correct. From the perspective of the butterfly effect, Qin Fangqing's death might be because a beggar in Zhongzhou State sneezed, or it might be because a group of Star State high school students made a beautiful three-point shot. These reasons were real and objective. They were right and wrong. Xing Tian looked at the paper silently. What would happen if he continued to write on this paper? He started with the dinner he cooked as a starting point, and then found lines that could be constantly developed and changed. For example, the kitchen supervisor had a small car accident. For example, Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai arrived in Yuzhou and returned to the hotel. For example, Qin Fangqing met Wu Jingmin. For example, the receptionist of the hotel was the daughter of a truck driver. These were 4 things, but if he continued, each of them had infinite development possibilities. The receptionist might have a relative who was an official, and he wanted to help the receptionist solve the problem. Maybe her boyfriend was a rich young master, and he planned to use his power. Involvement. Xing Tian now had 4 lines in his hands. And these 4 lines would be involved in any direction, and it would be more and more people would be involved. Each line had tens of thousands of different twists and turns. When more and more people were involved, these 4 lines would eventually merge in one direction and become a line. All the people involved would become branches and then develop again. Eventually it would definitely touch Qin Shi, and then touch the behind-the-scenes manipulator who killed Qin Shi. This could be said to be the butterfly effect. But more accurately, it was cause and effect. There was cause and effect. This was the power of cause and effect and also the ability of calligraphers. However, the direction of Xing Tian's investigation was obviously disturbed. Before his 4 lines formed an absolute connection, a young man suddenly appeared in the story. The brush and paper in his hands all exploded because of the appearance of the young man. Xing Tian didn't know who he was, but he was sure that the young man had an absolute relationship with Qin Fangqing's death. And this was something he couldn't write, even if he died. Xing Tian sat on the sofa, silently thinking about a way to get around this interference. He changed the pen and paper again. Just at the moment when the tip of the pen was about to touch the paper, an earth-shattering sound suddenly rang in his ears. The sound was so loud that it almost completely shattered his whole consciousness in an instant. Xing Tian's brain was instantly in chaos. He turned his head in disbelief and looked at the door. Opposite the door was Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai's bedroom. That was the origin of the loud noise. And Qin Weibai was still in the bedroom. Chapter 1087. It was quiet in the luxury suite of the hotel. But Qin Weibai's mood was always up and down. All kinds of emotions were brewing in her heart, making her feel complicated. She was a little worried but not like it. She was happy but not like it. She was anxious but not like it. She was looking forward to it but not like it. Her body was still soft after being tossed and turned all night. That kind of extreme joy and satisfaction slowly dissipated, replaced by obvious sleepiness. All kinds of emotions kept emerging, seeming right but not right, making Qin Weibai feel a little confused. She felt as if something was going to happen, but she didn't know what it was. During this period she seemed to think of something. She put on her clothes and went downstairs with a blush on her face. She bought something from a nearby pharmacy and came back to try it, confirming that she was not pregnant. That was to say, her current mood had little to do with Li Tianlan's love for her day and night in the past month or so. But this kind of uneasy mood had a lot to do with Li Tianlan. Qin Weibai didn't tell anyone. She had never dreamed of Li Tianlan in her dreams since she was a child. This statement was not very exact, but it could be said to be accurate. In the trance, she had dreamed of many scenes related to Li Tianlan, but that feeling made Qin Weibai feel like she was watching a movie about the past. In those dreams there was Li Tianlan. But it was not Li Tianlan in reality. Li Tianlan's figure in the dream had always been vague. Even if he appeared beside her in the dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow, an erratic shadow. In Qin Weibai's dream, Li Tianlan's clothes, face and temperament changed thousands of times every second. The changes were so drastic that in Qin Weibai's consciousness, Li Tianlan in the dream had no facial features, and he was even a shadow without a body. But every time she saw that shadow, Qin Weibai's consciousness in the dream would tell her that it was Li Tianlan. She in the dream also believed it. She and the master of Samsara Palace, who was in Warefree Heights now, were really the same person. They had the same consciousness, the same habits, and the same thoughts. At a short distance, the two of them could share the hurt with each other or bear it alone. At a distance, their thoughts were completely synchronized. Both of them knew what the other was thinking all the time because it was their own thoughts. At a further distance, their dreams were completely synchronized. To be exact, when the master of Samsara Palace was in the southern hemisphere, and Qin Weibai was in the northern hemisphere, when they were resting at the same time, their dreams were completely identical. Therefore, for the current Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan was a ghost that had been lingering in her consciousness since she was a child. She kept synchronizing with the master of Samsara Palace and eventually became the same person. They had the same thoughts, so naturally they had the same feelings. Therefore, there was no obstacle for her to accept Li Tianlan. But she had always been confused. She loved him so much and was willing to give everything for him. But why was Li Tianlan just a shadow in her dream? More than 2 years ago, after the Eternal Sword of Mormons, the shadow that belonged to Li Tianlan, which was constantly changing every moment, began to appear more and more in Qin Weibai's dreams. Qin Weibai knew what was going on. This was the master of Samsara Palace's entrustment. In the past, Qin Weibai would also dream, but the source of Li Tianlan in her dreams was the master of Samsara Palace. Now the illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan frequently appeared in her dreams because, in a sense, the other Li Tianlan was already dead. She might not be completely dead, but she was definitely not alive in her current state. So Li Tianlan began to appear suddenly in her dreams. He appeared more and more often, but the shadow became more and more blurred. The master of Samsara Palace broke through the transcendent realm in the spiritual field in the Eternal Sword. Now Qin Weibai was improving every moment. There was no obstacle for her to enter the so-called transcendent realm. Before she went to the desert prison, she had been close to the so-called extreme realm in the spiritual field. Therefore she consciously built a garden in her dream. A garden where sunlight and flying snow danced together. That was her most hidden territory and the starting point of all her dreams. Qin Weibai's only regret was that there was no Li Tianlan in that garden. She even thought more than once that if she could completely connect her consciousness with Li Tianlan's and form a certain degree of thinking synchronization, then in her dreams, could she also bring Li Tianlan into that garden and let their dreams be completely connected? In this way, even if she was not by his side in the future, she could see him in her dreams. It was not him in her imagination, but the real consciousness of Li Tianlan in her dreams. If she let him bully her in her dreams, she would not let him be so gluttonous and unrestrained as he was now. She really thought about this problem seriously. Then she saw Li Tianlan in her dreams. Li Tianlan in his youth. The ancient tree, the wind and snow, the dense sword marks, the boy, and the wooden sword were not things in Qin Weibai's dreams. There was only the garden in her dream, which was the source of the dream. In the source, if Qin Weibai didn't want her dream to expand freely, she could make herself stay in the garden and see nothing out of the control of her spirit. But in such a state she actually saw Li Tianlan. This was obviously an unusual scene. But why would such a situation occur? The teenager Li Tianlan in the dream was extremely clear and real, just like the child who really lived in Qin Weibai's dream. Qin Weibai woke up at that moment. But when she woke up, she still felt that the child was still living in the snow beside the garden. The ancient tree had collapsed, but he seemed to know nothing and still sat there quietly. That feeling was unparalleled. Qin Weibai could be sure that it was not Li Tianlan constructed by her consciousness. The Li Tianlan she constructed with her consciousness was just a faint shadow. He was not a teenager, and even his figure was extremely vague. And not to mention that she had not reached the transcendent realm. Even if she had really entered the transcendent realm, she could not merge her consciousness with Li Tianlan's to form synchronization in the dream. This kind of thing, according to Qin Weibai's understanding, could only exist in fantasy, and it was just fantasy. So who was the teenager in her dream? Qin Weibai was a little uneasy. She carefully recalled the garden in the dream. The flowers were bright, the sun was bright, and the snow was cold. The teenager outside the garden was quiet and plain. It was a very beautiful picture, but it was so beautiful that it was not lively at all. Qin Weibai suddenly felt an indescribable sense of strangeness and horror. It was normal for her to recall every scene in the dream. But the more she thought about it, the weirder she felt. That kind of deeply hidden weirdness was originally completely hidden, but with the appearance of the young Li Tianlan, all the abnormalities were revealed little by little. Qin Weibai sat on the bed and wrapped herself in the quilt. The flying snow crossed the sky through the opened curtains. Without Li Tianlan, the bedroom suddenly became very cold. She sat quietly like this. She didn't eat at noon. As time went by, she became more and more sleepy and began to struggle with her eyelids, but she always forced herself to hold on. At the thought of the teenager Li Tianlan in the dream, she felt a little scared and even dared not sleep. However, the extreme mental fatigue caused her consciousness to become deeper and deeper, deeper and deeper. Qin Weibai's body slid from the sitting position little by little. She lay down again and fell asleep again in a daze. It was still the bright and colorful garden. But the sunshine in the sky disappeared. The snowflakes were scattered and dancing. Qin Weibai stood where she was, feeling the gloomy sky in the dream, and understood that it was because she was too tired now. The flowers in the garden swayed slightly in the wind and snow. Qin Weibai stood stiffly in the garden in the dream, looking straight ahead. She even dared not turn her head. From her position, as long as she turned right, she could see the gate of the garden. If the teenager was still there, she might see the teenager Li Tianlan first. Qin Weibai on the bed breathed unsteadily and frowned. In the dream she was already extremely nervous. The wind and snow in the air seemed to be much fiercer. In the dream Qin Weibai clearly felt the cold. She kept taking deep breaths several times before she controlled herself to slowly turn her head. The first thing that came into her sight was not the gate of the garden, nor the teenager Li Tianlan outside the gate. Instead, it was a thick and old tree that blocked out the sky and the sun but was completely black. The dark giant tree stood outside the gate of the garden. In the wind and snow, the trunk, the treetop, the leaves, everything was quiet and almost dead without the slightest tremor. Qin Weibai's body was cold, and her heart kept sinking. It seemed to be the giant tree that she had seen before that had collapsed. However, when he entered the dream for the second time, the tree had returned to its original appearance. No, it seemed that many years had passed in the dream. Not only did the tree return to its original appearance, but it had also become even stronger. The entire tree had also begun to turn dark and deathly still. There was no teenager under the tree, no wooden sword. There was emptiness. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief. The moment her nervous mood relaxed, she suddenly froze again and looked carefully at the giant tree. Countless snowflakes fell under the crown of the giant tree, but the distribution of the snowflakes was somewhat different. There was a small area where the snowflakes seemed to be floating quietly. It seemed that there was something invisible there that supported the snowflakes and did not let them fall. Qin Weibai looked at it quietly. She looked for a long time before she finally confirmed that there seemed to be an illusory figure that had almost completely become nothingness there. He stayed there indifferently. If she did not look carefully, she could not find him at all. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. She knew that she dreamed of Li Tianlan again. In the case of extreme mental exhaustion, the control of the source of the garden was loosened. She dreamed of Li Tianlan at the source of the dream. The Li Tianlan in her dream was this shadow, which was changing every second and was almost transparent. After all, it was something in her consciousness. The coldness in Qin Weibai's heart slowly dissipated. She walked over briskly. In her dream, the Li Tianlan in her dream could do a lot of things. But this time, the illusory shadow that seemed like it would dissipate at any moment did nothing. He sat quietly under the tree as if he was extremely tired and resting, but also as if he was thinking about something. His posture looked a little strange. Qin Weibai looked for a long time before she realized that the shadow's body was a little tilted. This posture seemed to be held in someone's arms. Qin Weibai looked at it carefully. It meant that there was nothing next to the illusory shadow of Li Tianlan. Beside him, there was only the dark giant tree. The dark tree was far thicker than what she saw in the garden. But as Qin Weibai walked closer, the state of the giant tree became clear in her eyes. The giant tree in front of her seemed to be torn apart as well. At this time, there were pieces of metal fragments of different colors inserted in the trunk of the giant tree. Qin Weibai couldn't recognize what kind of metal they were, but she could vaguely feel the color of the metal fragments. However, the originally colorful metal fragments were all dim at this time. Dense cracks spread on each fragment, which was shocking. The cracks spread from the roots to countless branches. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even more pieces of metal were densely packed together. The black giant tree was completely torn by the metal fragments. The giant tree was trembling slightly, and the dark and lusterless sap slowly flowed down from the trunk, like pieces of black blood. Qin Weibai's brows were tightly knitted together. The illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan was still sitting there, as if it would dissipate at any time, but it never did. Qin Weibai stopped in front of the shadow and looked at the giant tree behind him. The giant tree trembled more and more obviously, and the black blood seemed to have flowed into a small waterfall. She didn't know why, but Qin Weibai suddenly felt that the tree should be much bigger than what she had seen. The source of her dream was limited, so the tree seemed to have shrunk many times. It was a very natural feeling. She felt that if the tree really existed, it would be almost infinitely tall, and every piece of metal fragment inserted in the trunk would probably be big enough to cover the whole sky. The tree and the fragments were infinitely shrunk. Only the size of the shadow was ordinary. Black blood flowed down from the trunk as if to completely drown the shadow. However, a powerful aura blocked all the black liquid outside. It seemed to be a sword energy. Qin Weibai was a little confused. When she walked out of the garden, the dream had already unfolded from the source. She didn't know why she had such a dream. The giant black tree was very close to her. Qin Weibai could clearly feel countless emotions from the patches of black blood. Bloody, cruel, evil, chaotic, violent, resentful. Dark and gloomy. The metal fragments inserted in the trunk reflected a faint light. The light was absolutely cold, with an absolutely complete and perfect law, forming a natural sense of repulsion. Qin Weibai really didn't dare to move for a moment. She suddenly found that whether she was close to the black giant tree or those metal fragments, she would end up horribly. She was only the safest when she was around the shadow. But the shadow itself was the most illusory. Tianlan, in the dream Qin Weibai called softly. The shadow was silent, motionless, and didn't respond at all. This was different from her usual dreams. Qin Weibai thought about it and did what she used to do in her dreams. This was her dream. Everything in front of her was a continuation of her consciousness. She had absolute authority here. In her dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow that was constantly changing every minute and second. Qin Weibai would try to focus her attention and her consciousness every time to make Li Tianlan become clear. Such an attempt had never succeeded. But she would keep trying until she woke up naturally. Qin Weibai gently sat next to the shadow and looked at it seriously. She began to concentrate her attention and focus her consciousness. The dream began to shake unstably. This was a sign that she was about to wake up after doing something deliberately in the dream. Qin Weibai looked at the shadow in front of her calmly. The shadow began to become clear in her constant concentration. A shallow, faint outline appeared in the almost transparent shadow. The outline began to have slight edges. A touch of color gradually appeared in her sight. It was purple. The moment the purple color appeared, it began to change into various complex colors. Qin Weibai had long been used to this change. However, this change only appeared for a few seconds today, and then it was completely fixed. The constantly changing color disappeared. A shocking black and red color appeared in front of Qin Weibai. No, it was not black and red. It was a black windbreaker. However, the windbreaker was stained with large patches of blood. The blood was almost smeared on every corner of the black windbreaker, which looked sad and tragic. The smell of blood began to appear in the dream. The black windbreaker with a corner stained with blood became completely clear and did not change. It did not change. Qin Weibai's heart began to sink like crazy, as if falling into an ice cave. Because this time, Li Tianlan's body was also fixed and did not change. More and more black windbreakers began to appear. The bloodstains spread all the way down. But what Qin Weibai saw was only a black windbreaker. In the dream she did not see Li Tianlan's leg. It seemed to be cut by an extremely sharp weapon. One of Li Tianlan's leg had completely disappeared. The wound seemed to have happened not long ago. Hot blood was flowing from the wound, and the hem of the windbreaker was almost completely soaked in blood. The shadow became clearer and clearer. Qin Weibai saw Li Tianlan's other leg. No, it was the other half of the leg. His calf also disappeared and so did his knee. Ghastly white bones and blood spread from his thigh. The surrounding air suddenly became hot and boiling. Li Tianlan's sleeve appeared. The empty sleeve was dancing feebly and blood slowly dripped down from the cuff. His other hand still looked good, but the skin of that arm had turned bluish-gray. Dense metal fragments were stuck in every corner of his arm, tearing his finger joints and tearing his muscles and blood vessels. It was a bloody arm, as if someone had fired thousands of bullets directly at the arm at the same time. The heart-wrenching pain broke out from Qin Weibai's consciousness in an instant. She saw most of Li Tianlan's body. She saw his chest and abdomen. The black windbreaker on his chest and abdomen had long been broken, and dense wounds crisscrossed his chest and abdomen. The blood and white bones stimulated Qin Weibai's nerves wildly. On his chest, Li Tianlan's left and right atriums were completely empty. His two hearts had been taken out and only blood was still flowing. Qin Weibai's body trembled violently. She had tried countless times to make the shadow that represented Li Tianlan become clear, but she never expected that the shadow would be in such a state after it became clear. It was a nightmare that she didn't want to recall in any case. She trembled and raised her head. At this moment, the shadow became completely real. She saw the shadow's head. That was Li Tianlan's head. This shadow was indeed Li Tianlan. One of Li Tianlan's eye sockets was empty and dark. The blood seemed to have completely solidified the moment the eyeball was taken out, and there was another shocking wound between his eyebrows. It seemed to be a fingerprint. It was this fingerprint that pressed between Li Tianlan's eyebrows, penetrated his brain completely in an instant, and cut off all his vitality. Qin Weibai almost suffocated. It was really Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's corpse. No, to be precise, it should be Li Tianlan's mutilated corpse. It was not even a complete corpse. This corpse, which seemed to have just died or fallen for countless years, sat there quietly. His face was covered with blood, but with a strange calmness and exhaustion. The moment this figure appeared, the giant black tree and the endless metal fragments behind him became completely quiet. The black blood disappeared, the giant tree was no longer shaking, and the metal fragments were no longer reflecting light. All the auras also disappeared, as if all of them had become dormant and chosen to retreat. The mutilated corpse still sat quietly, not looking at Qin Weibai, just quietly looking at the distance in the dream. The world was spinning. Qin Weibai screamed out loud. Not in the dream, but in the bedroom. Her body sat up from the bed in an instant, her eyes red, her face covered with tears, and she looked miserable. Why? Her body trembled violently. Why did I have such a dream? It's not a dream. A soft and ethereal voice rang out beside Qin Weibai. It was soft and pleasant, with a sense of intimacy. Qin Weibai was quiet for a moment. She turned her head. A figure shrouded in light sat quietly on the side of the bed, looking at her silently. Qin Weibai couldn't see her face or expression, but she could only be sure that it was a woman. It seemed that her consciousness was still immersed in the dream. She was stunned for a long time, and the first question was not how the other party came in, but asked with a trembling voice, "If it's not a dream, what is it?" "That is His Majesty Li Tianlan." In the light, the woman said softly, "Whether it is the shadow you saw or the mutilated corpse, they are all," after a pause she said, "they are all his most real state." Chapter 1088. Qin Weibai didn't speak for a long time. A shadow and a mutilated corpse. The most real state. In the halo beside the bed, the voice of the slim figure was clear and sweet. Qin Weibai suddenly felt extremely disgusted and repulsed. Because of the content of that sentence. Li Tianlan's real state. Could it be that the so-called true state was the phantom and the mutilated corpse? She forced herself to calm down and shook her head. "I don't believe it," she said in a cold voice. The halo beside the bed fluctuated softly. She didn't speak. For some reason at this moment, Qin Weibai suddenly felt that the woman in the halo seemed to want to get close to her, but in the end she didn't move. The truth is in the dream. Whether you believe it or not, it doesn't change anything. The woman in the halo said softly. She seemed to see the shadow and the mutilated corpse in Qin Weibai's dream. In the slightly swaying halo, Qin Weibai felt a clear pain and sadness. If that is Tianlan's real state, then what is Tianlan now? Qin Weibai stared at the light around her and asked word by word. "That is the reality you see." Qin Weibai sneered. "We see it? Then what about the shadow in my dream?" "It is the reality in the illusion." In the halo, the woman's answer was still gentle and without hesitation. Qin Weibai suddenly felt a little cold. With their questions and answers, the whole world seemed to have unknowingly become gloomy. It was as if there was some kind of danger brewing quietly and slowly. Then it would erupt bit by bit, bringing with it a deadly murderous intent. Qin Weibai felt a little dizzy. All the cold air in the air seemed to be circling around the ball of light beside the bed, and then she quietly endured it. The scene in front of her seemed a little familiar, and so did the dizziness in her mind. Qin Weibai was stunned and subconsciously said, "This is the malice of the world?" The slightly swaying light paused for a moment. The woman seemed a little surprised, but then she nodded. "Yes. That is to say, you know Shenyuan Wushang?" Qin Weibai asked again. She thought of some information revealed by Shenyuan Wushang. "He said he has a sister. Is that you?" "No." The woman said softly, "But to a certain extent, I can be considered his older sister. You can also say that I am his younger sister. But now I am his aunt." Qin Weibai looked at the soft light in silence. For the first time she realized that her IQ seemed to be a little off. Was she an elder sister, a younger sister, or an aunt? This relationship was absolutely chaotic, but the logic seemed to be very clear. However, from such a relationship, Qin Weibai could not arrange it for a while. "Who are you?" Qin Weibai asked. The woman seemed to be stunned. She was silent for a long time. If she hadn't found out that something had happened to Qin Weibai, she wouldn't have come here now. This kind of meeting made her feel a little nervous. She did not know how to answer Qin Weibai's question. From a certain point of view, Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai were her parents. But from another perspective, they could no longer be considered his parents. "I am Feng Qinggu." After a long period of silence, the woman finally spoke. She only said her name softly. Qin Weibai rubbed her forehead. Just like the first time she met Shenyuan Wuxiang, Li Tianlan didn't have any hostility but felt close to him. She felt the same closeness to Feng Qinggu now, even more so than Li Tianlan felt for Shenyuan Wuxiang. "Feng Qinggu," she whispered to herself. "You can call me Qinggu." The voice in the halo murmured as if it was acting coquettishly. Qin Weibai wanted to laugh, but she was really not in the mood. She rubbed between her eyebrows like Li Tianlan and said softly, "That dream, what's going on?" "It's a real projection projected in your consciousness. Of course, from your point of view now, it's also illusory. But no matter what the situation is, its existence needs to be affirmed." The temperature in the air seemed to be colder, with a bone-chilling coldness. Qin Weibai knew very well that if this was the malice of the world, then the malice now was many times greater than the malice that Shenyuan Wuxiang and Li Tianlan had suffered. Because at that time, Qin Weibai only felt a little dizzy, but now she clearly felt the changes in the surrounding space. Real. Illusory. These were the two most common words, but now every time she heard them, Qin Weibai's heart would feel cold for no reason. "I don't understand." Qin Weibai hesitated for a moment and said slowly, "Can you give me more details?" "I can't say." Feng Qingwu said softly. "But you can ask, maybe I can answer some." Qin Weibai did not know what to ask. Now all her mind was focused on the mutilated corpse and the illusory shadow in the dream. She did not dare to think about what it represented. Did it represent Li Tianlan's future? As soon as this thought popped up, Qin Weibai felt weak all over. Feng Qingwu seemed to know something, but Qin Weibai didn't dare to believe everything she said. But she didn't dare to disbelieve it either. The only topic she could talk about now seemed to be this. "In that dream, I dreamed of Tianlan." Qin Weibai wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "That is indeed His Majesty, but not the future His Majesty. Although it is not very accurate, if we must describe it, it should be the past His Majesty." Feng Qingwu said. Qin Weibai's heart trembled slightly. Her ability to accept things was obviously not comparable to that of ordinary people. With her other self as a living example, she easily thought of a direction that others did not dare to think of. "You mean reincarnation and rebirth?" "There is no such thing as reincarnation in this world." Feng Qingwu said slowly, "It's reincarnation, not your Majesty's personal reincarnation, but..." "Kacha?" Feng Qingwu, the voice suddenly disappeared. In Qin Weibai's sight, the empty air suddenly twisted, and a piercing coldness broke out in an instant, turning into an ice wind. Shocking ice layers began to appear in the empty air. Feng Qingwu changed the topic and said softly, "Your understanding is wrong because of the problem of the timeline. But in fact, time has no meaning. What you experience is only your own timeline. When you put time in a wide enough area, you will find that the so-called present may be the future in another area, and the future may be the past in another area. What you see now is only the past relative to your current timeline. But whether it is the present or the future, that scene has happened." Qin Weibai was in a daze. "Why did I dream of this?" she asked softly. "You are waking up, or in other words, another you is waking up, and you have caused a synchronization in a sense." "What is waking up?" Feng Qingwu fell silent again. This was obviously a question she could not answer. "After waking up, will I see that kind of Tianlan? I am also very awake now, and I would rather not wake up like that." Qin Weibai continued. "This is an inevitable process." Feng Qingwu said slowly, "It is irreversible. And from our point of view, we all hope that you can speed up your awakening, even if it is for His Majesty." Qin Weibai looked at her quietly, waiting for her explanation. Feng Qingwu was silent for a while and said softly, "His Majesty's path has come to an end, and his experience is completely different from that of another you. The current level is already the peak state he can reach. He may be stronger, but it is impossible for him to break through again. Only when you gradually wake up can His Majesty really break through to that supreme realm." Qin Weibai thought for a while, and there was obvious suspicion in her eyes. Xinyuan Wuxiang didn't tell me this. This is not what he is qualified to know now. Feng Qingwu's tone was light. But in fact there is nothing wrong with Tianlan's current state. He is only 24 years old. In 10 years or even less he will definitely break through again and become a real heavenly son. There is no sign that he can't break through and he doesn't notice it himself. It's not that he can't break through. Feng Qingwu said calmly, he can't break through. Once he takes that step on his own, he'll be discovered. Discovered by who? Qin Weibai's heart suddenly sank. Feng Qingwu moved her body and said softly, do you still remember that story? The other story you experienced, the end of His Majesty. Qin Weibai's body quietly tensed up. That was undoubtedly her biggest secret. How did Feng Qingwu know? That's about it. But in that world, when everything happened, we all paid attention to it. But at that time, things were completely out of control, and we could no longer control the development of things. His Majesty took that step by himself in that world, and the end was already determined. Even if he didn't die under your sword, he would die in other places. Feng Qingwu said. Qin Weibai's face was a little gloomy. You mean if the current Tianlan breaks through again he will die? Yes. Feng Qingwu's answer was without any hesitation. Qin Weibai sat on the bed in a daze. After a while she asked, how do you know what happened in that world? Time is meaningless. Feng Qingwu said something inexplicable and continued to say, and the situation where you are now is a coincidence of time and space paradox. This is also the result of our efforts. In order to achieve this goal, we have paid a very heavy price. Feng Qingwu seemed to say something else. But Qin Weibai could not hear it at all. All her consciousness was attracted by Feng Qingwu's words. To achieve this goal. Forming this paradox. If the existence of two of her was really a kind of time and space paradox, then this was not a coincidence but created by Feng Qingwu? Was she created by them? Qin Weibai suddenly felt like laughing and crying at the same time. You mean I'm something that you guys created? A machine? It has nothing to do with you. Feng Qingwu shook her head. What we can do is to send you here. And to do all this, we did not create you but to modify time and space and physical constants. You will understand all this, provided that your awakening is smooth enough. Qin Weibai sat there in a daze. After a long time she whispered, if I wake up successfully, what will happen to Tianlan? His Majesty will return. Feng Qingwu's voice was slow, but with unparalleled solemnity and fanaticism. Qin Weibai did not speak. Qin Weibai continued to say, and what you need to do most is to synchronize your dream with His Majesty's thinking as you imagine. This is the first step for His Majesty to return. Wake up, return? Qin Weibai whispered softly, if I wake up and he returns, will we still be us? Of course. Feng Qingwu seemed to be smiling. In fact, you have woken up partly but obviously, you do not feel any change in yourself, nor will you become another person. I have woken up partly? Qin Weibai was stunned. Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai silently and whispered, maybe you don't realize it yourself, but you killed Chen Fangqing. After being stunned for a second, Qin Weibai suddenly reacted. I didn't do it. You don't need to do it. Feng Qingwu shook her head. You have thought about it? Qin Weibai sat on the bed, hugged her shoulders tightly and shook her head subconsciously. Who the hell are you? After a pause, she smiled somewhat self-deprecatingly. Or are you still human? Gods or demons? I am human. Feng Qingwu's tone was a little complicated, with certainty and a little confusion. She was silent for a moment and whispered, of course in the eyes of others they call me Dominator. Of course in the eyes of others they call me Dominator. Qin Weibai did not speak. Her bright eyes were a mess and countless thoughts appeared at the same time. She seemed to be a little confused and a little chaotic. You don't look very well. Feng Qingwu said. I'm just a little cold. Qin Weibai replied slowly. If you need warmth, Feng Qingwu smiled, I can give it to you. A soft and fluctuating light suddenly bloomed in front of Qin Weibai. Thousands of lights shone. The originally soft light became extremely cold in an instant. Feng Qingwu seemed to be reflecting the cold light of the metal. However, the surrounding air instantly became warm as spring. Time froze in an instant. The light of the metal was slightly refracted. The light shuttled and rushed into space at a speed faster than light. The virtual quantum network base station was instantly formed. Virtual shuttling and leaping in an instant. Feng Qingwu's consciousness went straight into the starry sky through the quantum network base station. The boundless Milky Way formed an incomparably dazzling yet extremely chaotic cosmic curve in her consciousness. The quantum transmission instantly crossed the distance of millions of light-years in the curve of the universe and went straight into the depths of the universe. Silence and dead silence appeared in an instant and disappeared in an instant. The perspective of her consciousness changed for half a second. Feng Qingwu's consciousness entered a large wormhole. The starry sky suddenly retreated. The wormhole shook violently. The boundless black tide seemed to tear the wormhole apart in the blink of an eye. It covered the sky and the earth and rushed directly to Feng Qingwu. It was a sword radiance that tore everything apart. It was crazy, cold, violent, domineering, with extreme excitement and calmness. With an almost invincible determination, the surging sword radiance completely covered Feng Qingwu. Feng Qingwu, whose consciousness was still reflecting the metal sword radiance, stopped for a moment. In the next second, an extremely majestic power instantly exploded in the sea of black sword qi. It was the extreme power of martial arts. The strong shock wave collided with the surging sword qi and the entire wormhole space was shaking violently. Feng Qingwu's movement paused slightly. All the power disappeared completely. In an instant, the boundless black tide seemed to have lost its target. It surged past her and rushed towards the entrance of the wormhole. Boring. Feng Qingwu said calmly. Iske? A voice seemed to be heard in the darkness. The voice came from an extremely far place accompanied by the intense collision sound. It was tough and calm. You're indeed interesting, Lord. Is this what you're relying on to bully my son? I'm only teaching him what he should do. Feng Qingwu said calmly. In a faraway place, a voice that seemed to come from another space directly penetrated the wormhole. It was as hard as iron and carried with it an eerie sharpness. Perhaps I should also teach you a lesson and let you know what you should do. Feng Qingwu said calmly, you're fighting against those things now, how are you going to teach me? Based on the amount of sword qi that you can produce, which is not even a billionth of what you had at your peak. Countless sword qi shook violently. The wormhole shattered instantly. It was already a battlefield in front of Feng Qingwu. The voice from afar shattered the wormhole. Instead of bringing Feng Qingwu to her destination, it brought her to the battlefield. You're the Princess Royal of the space-time corridor. This is where you should be. The black ocean surged and roared in front of Feng Qingwu. The boundless black ocean surged up hundreds of thousands of feet into the sky. The sword radiance whistled and shattered the stars. Countless metallic objects fell into the black ocean. The area of the battlefield was almost calculated in terms of light years. The crazy killing did not stop for even a moment. Countless races, large amounts of metal, the sky was filled with mechas and the dark, enshrouded shadows. Cannons, sword radiance, explosions, lacerations, and destruction. The endless number of battleships continued to pour out destructive power. The battlefield was filled with the humans and other races fighting against the dark shadows and mechas. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, it was vast and mighty, innumerable. Feng Qingwu sighed softly. Her body rose slowly in the void and charged towards her destination. The willpower of the god of war in the black ocean did not stop her this time. Feng Qingwu's speed increased. Boundless radiance shone from her body and became brighter and brighter. At this moment, she seemed to have turned into a shooting star that traversed the battlefield for a few light years. The radiance overflowed rapidly and surpassed the speed of light. With Feng Qingwu as the center, it spread rapidly in all directions. Deception, Genesis. Radiance shot out and stars fell. On the battlefield, the potentials of all the creatures in the neutral camp were instantly stimulated several times. All the heavily injured creatures that had lost their ability to fight were deceived. Everyone thought that they were in their peak condition. They exploded with battle power that exceeded their limits and pounced towards the nearby enemies. The battle power of all the creatures was increasing rapidly. Everyone had been deceived. At this moment, everyone thought that their strength had suddenly made a huge breakthrough. Everyone also showed their strength after the breakthrough. Outside of the neutral camp, all the creatures, be it order or dark shadow, became sluggish. They were also deceived. At this moment they thought that they had been severely injured. Some of the creatures even thought that they had died. The shooting star radiance that Feng Qingwu brought along traversed the entire battlefield. It rose infinitely and exploded instantly. It was as if a gigantic sun had suddenly risen in the dead silent void. The boundless black ocean instantly began to boil. The rays of the sun continued to radiate with lies. In the shortest time possible, it deceived the entire battlefield. This was the pinnacle of the path of deception. It was also the pinnacle leader of the human race on this path. This was the pinnacle of power on the path of deception. This power had a name that was recognized by all the camps. Ruler. Chapter 1089. Shuttling, flying, warping, the battlefield covered every corner of one's vision. Countless figures filled every space with an unimaginable density. The vast void, the planets beneath one's feet, the broken satellites, the densely packed meteorite belts, the flames of war and radiance were everywhere. The densely packed formations of the fleets opened fire with all their might. The Star Destroyer cannons could destroy the heavens and the earth. The annihilation of dark matter and dark energy surged silently. A small black hole formed in a certain area of the battlefield and started to devour everything nearby. Using the void as a formation and the galaxy as a chess piece, Feng Qingwu's consciousness was tiny and weak like a speck of dust in the vast and boundless battlefield. However, it was this tiny and weak figure that traversed the entire battlefield in an instant as though she had entered an uninhabited land. The radiance that filled the sky continued to condense. Feng Qingwu's consciousness charged forward, leaving behind one sun after another that emitted extreme light and heat. The absolute destructive power and the instantaneous reversal of the situation clearly displayed the powerful strength of the peak energy source of the neutral camp. However, Feng Qingwu was not intercepted by the peak energy source of the opposing camp. Deception, Genesis. This was equivalent to simulating the real environment. In a short period of time, she made full use of all factors that were beneficial to her side and made full use of all factors that were disadvantageous to the enemy. She deceived both the enemy's and her allies' understanding of herself, as well as the perception of the peak energy source of the same level. In an absolutely short period of time, even if it was an enemy of the same level as Feng Qingwu, even if she traversed the battlefield in such a high-profile manner, no one would discover her existence. Based on the actual time in Miracle City and other places, the Genesis had existed for a very short period of time, probably less than 10 years. However, 10 years was enough to determine the fate of this part of the battlefield. However, what was the use of merely determining the fate of this part of the battlefield? The fate of the human race and all the neutral creatures had already been determined and would definitely end. Perhaps in the entire neutral camp, only the vast black ocean before them refused to give up. It was still going all out, still throwing caution to the wind, still going berserk without the slightest scruple. Perhaps he already knew his fate and ending long ago, but he did not care. War God Lin Xinyuan. He was a lunatic and a fool, but he was the most admirable kind of lunatic and fool. Feng Qingwu sighed softly. Endless light converged around her, and her shuttling figure suddenly accelerated. Like a sharp sword that tore through the battlefield, with slowly dissipating light, she instantly entered the black hole that had just formed in the battlefield. Deception, Supreme Self. On the battlefield where light and shadow intertwined, an almost supreme will appeared. It was cold, majestic, and irresistible. The moment this willpower appeared, it went against the evil intentions of the world. The black hole that was still taking shape instantly turned into a wormhole. The laws of time and space distorted at a speed visible to the naked eye. Feng Qingwu's body entered the wormhole and appeared tens of thousands of light years away in the blink of an eye. The moment her body entered the black hole, an endless army of the neutral faction rushed out of the same wormhole and joined the battlefield. This was the true ruler. On the battlefield he ruled over everything. The black hole that had just formed was turned into a two-way passageway by Feng Qingwu's lies. It was the same entrance, but there was no difference between entering and exiting. This kind of deception could only last for a few years, but it was enough for the neutral camp to invest billions of soldiers into the battlefield in the next few years. The stars in the sky flickered and retreated rapidly. The newly formed wormhole extended infinitely in Feng Qingwu's consciousness. The darkness only lasted for a moment, but it was already tens of thousands of light years away. It was still the same scene, the same battlefield, the same black ocean, and the same war god Lin Xinyuan. The black ocean formed by the endless sword intense was the most real state of war god Lin Xinyuan, and also his most primitive form of existence. At the start of the war, this ocean surged into the corridor of time and space from the realm of war to the corridor of time and space. For tens of thousands of years, it spread across countless star regions. Everyone in the corridor of time and space agreed that this lunatic was the sharpest lunatic of the human race after His Majesty. The war continued. Even Feng Qingwu did not know how many star regions Lin Xuanyuan's sword aura had passed through and how many enemies of the same level as him had fought. Feng Qingwu did not look at the battlefield and continued to travel. Time and distance seemed to have lost their meaning. She traveled again and again. When Feng Qingwu's consciousness traveled through the wormhole, She suddenly felt a majestic force from the outside world penetrating the wormhole and instantly extending the distance she could travel. Feng Qingwu felt slightly relieved. She knew that she was finally close to her destination. This majestic force was the aura of the War King of the corridor of time and space. In the next second, the silence disappeared completely and there was no more killing. An extremely huge planet appeared in front of Feng Qingwu. This planet rotated slowly, almost occupying all of Feng Qingwu's consciousness. Feng Qingwu was in a trance for a moment. In front of this planet, Miracle City was like a child's toy block in front of a skyscraper. The strong contrast stunned Feng Qingwu, who had already placed all of her attention on Miracle City. She finally reached her destination. This was the capital of the corridor of time and space. Old Capital City. Feng Qingwu took a step forward. Her destination was very clear. Therefore, when she took a step, she deceived the distance between time and space. The chaotic meteorite belt and the atmosphere changed instantly. Feng Qingwu's consciousness had already appeared in an extremely huge palace. The ancient bronze palace was a little mottled and old. Faint lights flickered in every corner of the palace. The space was filled with a clear and ancient aura. In the palace, darkness and light bloomed at the same time and disappeared at the same time. Everything was silent. "Qingwu, what's the matter?" A gentle voice suddenly rang out inside the palace. An extremely gentle golden light suddenly lit up in the deepest part of the palace. Like the rising sun, the golden light shone from afar. The light and darkness in front of her instantly lost all their colors. That golden light instantly became the only thing in the palace. Feng Qingwu floated forward silently for a while. The further she went, the brighter and gentler the golden light became. The light shone on the bronze pillars in the palace, clearly illuminating the countless mottled marks on the bronze pillars. Feng Qingwu arrived at the end of the palace. A gentle golden light shone from the end of the palace. There was an ancient desk there. On the desk there was a thick book that was about the height of a person. It was slowly flipping through the pages. There was no one behind the desk in the book. All the light was above the desk and the book. It was a light that was constantly changing. Sometimes, it was a divine weapon, sometimes, it was a misty cloud. In essence, this tiny and changing speck of light was a drop of blood. There was no corpse or shadow. It was just a drop of blood. Feng Qingwu looked at the drop of blood in front of her. She bowed slightly and said softly, "Greetings, Your Majesty." "What's the matter?" The gentle voice in the golden light was clear and gentle. "I want the million-world portrait." Feng Qingwu answered without any hesitation. Her voice was firm and unquestionable. The majesty in the golden light fell silent for a second. The million-world portrait. One of the most important weapons in the corridor of time and space. It was also one of the 4 most powerful divine weapons in the neutral camp. King Wei million-world portrait, Tower of Human Emperor, Shenyuan sword. Among the 4 divine weapons, the million-world portrait was ranked second. It had never changed in countless reincarnations. If Feng Qingwu was the pinnacle representative of deceit, then the majesty in front of her was the pinnacle of calligraphers and warriors. The million-world portrait was something that the majesty had studied for his entire life. Not only did it contain his calligraphy, but it also contained the calligraphy of every calligrapher in the corridor of time and space. The million-world portrait had existed for thousands of years. Every painting had the ability to split open the sky. Similarly, the million-world portrait was the only divine weapon in the corridor of time and space that could contain the Majesty's drop of blood. Without the million-world portrait, the vitality of the Majesty's drop of blood would gradually dissipate. He would become weaker and weaker until he died. It was destined to be a long time. Unfortunately, time was meaningless. Since there was a possibility of death, the reality of death might appear in the next second. It might be 10,000 years for Feng Qingwu or a minute for the Majesty, sure. A second later, the Majesty's voice was heard. "Which one do you want?" "The Book of Creation." Feng Qingwu seemed a little surprised, but she still answered the Majesty's question quickly. The thick book on the table flipped a few pages and a clear tearing sound was heard in the palace. A thin page fell out of the book and landed in Feng Qingwu's hand. It was as light as a feather. However, the thick book on the table became thinner by about 10%. Streaks of vital energy flew out of the palace and spread into the void. It was the vitality of the Majesty's blood dissipating. Feng Qingwu remained silent for a while and said softly, "Thank you." The Majesty's laughter echoed in the bronze palace. It was carefree and calm. "What?" Feng Qingwu couldn't help but ask. The Majesty seemed a little confused. "The Book of Creation is very important to you too." Feng Qingwu said, If I'm not wrong, you spent most of your time resting in the Book of Creation. The vitality of your blood overflowed into the Book of Creation and returned to your body. How long could you last without the Book of Creation? Actually, I was mentally prepared for you to reject me because of the corridor of time in the human race. The human race's overall situation, His Majesty whispered to himself and then laughed. His laughter was very soft at first, but then it became louder and louder. However, it was not the kind of hysterical laughter. This laughter was clear, calm, indifferent, open-minded, and finally turned into a faint tiredness. The human clan. What's the big picture? Feng Qingwu was shocked and asked subconsciously, "What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said." The Majesty said calmly, "I gave you the Book of Creation because you need it more than I do. Tell me about Her Highness's situation?" "Her situation is very special." Feng Qingwu was a little uneasy and thought about the Majesty's words. She said subconsciously, "In the past few samsara cycles, even if there were returnees, none of them were at the level of the two of them. Their existence can't be replicated. The so-called experience we summarized is only based on the other returnees and the process of your return. In fact, no matter you, me or anyone else, is worthy of being mentioned in the same breath as them. We can't speculate the process of their return. According to my observation, Your Majesty Tianlan has now vaguely come into contact with part of the power of Tianju. This also means that if Your Majesty returns, you will at least reach the 7th level of authority. This is only the most conservative estimate." "Tianju," the Majesty pondered and sighed softly. "This time, does it start from martial arts?" "Martial arts has never been for the weak." Feng Qingwu said indifferently, "Over the years the King of War has lost some competitiveness. You haven't taken any action. Countless people in the corridor of time and space think that the path of martial arts has lost its former glory. But is that really the case?" "Of course not." The Majesty laughed softly. "This is the first path of the human race. Perhaps compared to order and shadow, it has congenital flaws and shortcomings. But I always believe that this path represents true invincibility. Look at Lin Xinyuan and Wang Fuxing." Feng Qingwu said. When His Majesty didn't take action, the two from the God of War realm and the Emperor Palace represented the peak of martial arts in the neutral camp, the God of War. Lin Xinyuan stood at the pinnacle of martial arts and had personally slain the apocalypse of the Order faction. The current God of War was the strongest blade cutting through thorns and thorns for the human race. The most ancient path of martial arts was constantly bursting forth with great vitality in the most chaotic and dangerous situation. Therefore, Feng Qingwu didn't think there was any problem with his path of return. "What about Her Highness?" His Majesty asked slowly. Feng Qingwu obviously hesitated and said softly, "I'm not very sure. But so far she seems to have shown some ability that belongs to Dream, but it is very weak. It is precisely because of this ability that she came into contact with the real imprint that Your Majesty left in the deepest part of her consciousness in order to protect her. I think this should be caused by Her Highness, who is now in hibernation. But we can't detect her situation. We can only detect something from Qin Weibai. This is also what I want to say. Her Highness could survive because of the real imprint that Your Majesty left in the deepest part of her consciousness. That is to say, Your Majesty's real imprint is in Qin Weibai's consciousness. Now Your Majesty has shown an ability similar to the heavenly end. If Her Highness Qin Weibai can further wake up and synchronize her consciousness with Your Majesty's, then His Majesty may come into contact with his real imprint and speed up the pace of return. In that case, when His Majesty returns, he may not be a heavenly end but—" Feng Qingwu paused and said, "God of Massacre." His Majesty let out a sigh of relief. With expectation and understanding he said, "So you want the picture of all worlds?" "Yes." Feng Qingwu said slowly, "But I didn't expect you to really give it to me." The topic came back again. His Majesty didn't avoid it this time. He just said softly, "It doesn't matter. There is nothing in the space-time corridor that can't be given to them. The big picture. Without the space-time corridor, the so-called big picture is just an illusion." Suddenly, the faint golden light began to brighten. His Majesty's voice became calm and determined. "Maybe I should go out for a walk in case the God of War takes all the limelight." Some of the premonitions in his heart became reality. Feng Qingwu's heart slightly sank. "You're right," His Majesty said calmly. The golden light began to leave the desk and move forward slowly. "Maybe this is the last time we meet." His Majesty's voice was calm and powerful. "There will be no miracle. We are about to face another failure. Our doomsday is coming. I'm ashamed to face His Majesty and Her Highness. His Majesty said softly, as the human emperor of the space-time corridor, I have never really completed my mission in the long years. All of us are ashamed to face His Majesty and Her Highness. The human clan has never obtained the right to survive. His Majesty laughed self-deprecatingly. It has never happened. Neutral camp. The god of war dominated the world. The human emperor was calm. The 4 great divine artifacts stabilized the overall situation. In the long years, countless reincarnations, they were destroyed and reborn in the illusion and reality. The human clan was like an ant. They had always been fighting for survival, but they had never obtained the right to survive. What they obtained was just the power to struggle. They tried their best, tried everything, and struggled desperately without compromising. Then they were destroyed and exterminated again and again. Everything must have an end. When I return again, I am still me but also not me. His Majesty looked at Feng Qingwu and said softly, You are still you but also not you. When I return again, maybe I won't be your sister. Whatever it is. His Majesty laughed softly. You should also arrange a way out for yourself. My way out is in the City of Miracles. Feng Qingwu said softly. She had already found a suitable candidate, so she was not afraid of the end of the world. Her smile was even a little happy. I can be his daughter again. The only regret is that I have to change my mother. That should be a good candidate. His Majesty laughed. He looked into the distance, and his gaze seemed to fall on the person who was also called the Human Emperor in the Human Palace, on the God of War who was still slowly struggling in the void, on King Jinjian, on the King of War, and on all the human clan. Everything must have an end. The other party was already here. So he would fall. Feng Qingwu would fall. The God of War would also fall. Everyone's ending had long been destined, and it would come to an end. Let's go. His Majesty said softly. In the Bronze Palace, the golden light instantly bloomed and shot straight into the distant void. Feng Qingwu gently raised her palm. In the extremely distant void, a big hand filled with dark energy and dark matter instantly formed. The world was deceived by lies. The illusory hand slowly moved down and finally enveloped a star that was at its peak. In the next second, the big hand disappeared. The star also disappeared. The endless light and heat were instantly replaced by the cold void. A pearl that was burning with warm light appeared in Feng Qingwu's hand. She picked up the stars with her bare hands. Feng Qingwu calmly held the pearl and slowly put it into the page of the chapter of creation in her other hand. The yellowed page instantly became warm and shone with a soft light. The soft light gently fluctuated, and Feng Qingwu's figure disappeared. Only the Bronze Palace was left. It was silent, dead and empty, as if it had existed since ancient times without any vitality. Feng Qingwu opened her eyes again. In her sight was the wind and snow outside the hotel. It was Qin Weibai who was quietly hugging her snow-white shoulders on the bed. Chapter 1090. Time was meaningless. Feng Qingwu's consciousness traveled through the void. Her time was moving, but Qin Weibai's time was still. Therefore, everything happened in less than a second. In Qin Weibai's consciousness, Feng Qingwu said that she could give her warmth. She didn't do anything extra, but a light and delicate page appeared on her slender palm. The moment the hazy light appeared, it seemed to completely suppress the light in the bedroom. The hotel room seemed to have ushered in dusk, becoming hazy, beautiful, and warm. That touch of warmth slowly spread out, allowing one to subconsciously relax both mentally and physically. Qin Weibai raised her head and looked at the page in Feng Qingwu's hand. Feng Qingwu loosened the page in Qin Weibai's direction and said gently, "A gift for you." "What is this?" Qin Weibai asked after being stunned for a while. The item in Feng Qingwu's hand looked like a thin piece of paper, yet it also looked like a light source that would never dry up. The piece of paper was dark yellow and old, and the light was sparse and hazy. It did not look beautiful, but it attracted everyone's attention and consciousness almost instinctively, as if all the light had appeared on that piece of paper. "This is what you need the most." Feng Qingwu loosened her palm slightly. The paper fluttered into Qin Weibai's hand without a trace of smoke or fire. Sadness flashed across her eyes, which were enveloped by the gentle light. Then they became a little hollow. The creation chapter of the Picture of Thousand Worlds. This was the foundation of the Picture of Thousand Worlds, one of the 4 divine weapons of the neutral camp. It was also the first chapter. Now that the creation chapter had been removed, the Picture of Thousand Worlds had lost its foundation. The drop of blood that relied on the Picture of Thousand Worlds had also lost its foundation. Without Her Majesty, the neutral camp had lost its foundation. The real end was coming. There was no way to stop it or resist it. Perhaps it was just like what Her Majesty had said, the human race no longer had the so-called big picture. Because everything would be destroyed. In the face of extreme extinction, all perseverance was meaningless. Feng Qingwu knew that was really the last time she met Her Majesty. After extinction we return again. He is not him and I am not me. Since the beginning of the human clan's emergence in the starry sky, they had been struggling with all their might to survive. The first His Majesty and Her Highness had tried their best, paid everything and failed again and again. In the end they became the currently Tianlan and Qin Weibai. Now that His Majesty had taken over the authority, he had also tried hard but failed again and again. There was no direction, no end, no hope. Standing at the highest point of the camp and looking forward, there was only ghastly darkness. The stranger road brought with it eternal silence and dullness that stretched to the end of despair. Just like everyone wants to live but everyone will die. No one had ever achieved true immortality, and no one had ever fought for the right of survival for the human race. The history of the development of the human race seemed to be one of continuous failures from beginning to end, with no success at all. This period of history was recorded in the Million World Scroll, and it became one of the most powerful artifacts in the neutral faction. Meanwhile, the drop of blood that His Majesty had transformed into had already left the ancient book and rushed back into the void. The end was just around the corner. He would not go back. Vast and boundless battlefields now covered every star field, and the flames of war continued to burn. The chaotic light would reach Earth many years later, but even if Earth still existed at that time, the war would have already ended. Feng Qingwu was in a trance. She could imagine the scene of that drop of blood rushing into the void after leaving the Million World Scroll. She could also imagine the insolence of him facing countless peak existences with his Shenyuan sword. That was the scene that had once appeared in the chaotic river of time. It was peerless and invincible, the last sad song of the human clan. Everything would end. That drop of blood was now burning everything. He was destroying the corridor of time and space that he had created, and was using all means to restart the reincarnation for the human clan. Feng Qingwu sighed softly, looked at Qin Weibai and said softly, "There's not much time left." What? Qin Weibai was stunned. Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai silently. She walked to the bed and sat down. Hesitantly she reached out and hugged Qin Weibai. An incomparably soft brilliance completely enveloped Qin Weibai. In the light, Qin Weibai saw a beautiful face that was somewhat similar to her and Li Tianlan's. The moment their bodies touched, Qin Weibai's heart suddenly skipped a beat. It was an incomparably real and clear feeling of being connected by blood. That feeling was so obvious yet so unfamiliar. Your mental state isn't very good right now. The thing I gave you can help you stabilize your consciousness and make you calmer. Feng Qingwu said softly. Qin Weibai was still recalling the feeling of that hug. It felt like she was hugging a child that she had not seen for many years. It was a little strange, but the feeling of being connected by blood was so real and close. Qin Weibai did not have children, so she could not accurately describe that feeling. But the moment Feng Qingwu hugged her, her whole heart seemed to be completely melted. After a while, Feng Qingwu let go of Qin Weibai. "You said that my mental state is not stable?" she asked softly. Feng Qingwu nodded and said yes. Qin Weibai silently thought about her own state. She was a master in the field of spirit. Before today, no, even until now, she did not feel that her mental state was unstable. What was happening now was really a bit magical. But Qin Weibai, who had even experienced the so-called rebirth, did not feel that she could not bear those inexplicable but not too clear things. If my unstable state continues, what will happen? I don't know. Feng Qingwu shook her head. I never predict things that will not happen. You have received my gift, so your problem is no longer a problem. If I have to speculate, maybe you will become a lunatic or a psychopath or something else. But these are not important now. What's important is that my gift can help you a lot. Is that so? Qin Weibai whispered to herself and looked down at the page floating in her hand. The star that Feng Qingwu had placed in the book had already been compressed into the purest and most gentle energy. The energy that was countless times more powerful than the sun was compressed infinitely and filled every corner of the chapter of creation gently. It brought warmth and relaxation to the reader's body and mind. But even if this page was injected with the energy of a large star, it was still dark on the page. Only the extremely hazy and warm light penetrated through the darkness. Qin Weibai looked at it silently. There seemed to be a mass of black fog in the glowing dark paper, but it was also like a dense chaos. The absolute silence and darkness seemed to be completely still. This kind of color attracted all of Qin Weibai's attention. She kept looking at it, and then suddenly realized that the black on the paper was not necessarily pure darkness. Even darkness could not be so quiet. This darkness was like real nothingness. There was nothing, not even darkness. The absolute nothingness seemed to condense into a point of infinite mass, infinitely small volume, and infinitely high density. This point of nothingness slowly rotated on the page. In silence, without a sound, without a change in expression. Qin Weibai was silent for a long time before she whispered, "I don't feel anything wrong with my spirit. By the time you can feel it, it will be too late." Feng Qingwu shook her head. "Maybe you won't believe what I said, but some signs have already appeared. You and the other you existed at the same time, but you were originally a part of the space-time paradox. However, the other you started to walk on the path of awakening in the process of near extinction. During this period of time, your consciousness has been cut off. However, this is not cutting off, but the gap between the two of you has widened. This has already increased the mental burden on you, and you didn't even feel the changes in yourself. The most obvious point is that you did not want to kill Qin Fangqing so soon, but in fact you have already killed him. This means that your spirit has been out of control to some extent. I did not kill Qin Fangqing." Holding this page, Qin Weibai was unprecedentedly sober. She seemed to really calm down and her voice became stable. "But you wanted to kill him," Feng Qingwu said. Qin Weibai frowned and vaguely felt that she had caught something. But when she asked Feng Qingwu, she could not hear Feng Qingwu's answer at all. Qin Weibai thought for a moment and suddenly thought of a very important question. A very slight chill flashed in her eyes and she whispered, "I remembered one thing." "What?" Feng Qingwu was a little confused. "You said that I am an extremely rare paradox of time and space. Obviously, no matter how rare I am now, I am not the only one. If I am a paradox, then how do you explain Jiang Shangyu? Is he also a paradox created by you?" Qin Weibai asked. "Jiang Shangyu?" There was a strange emotion in Feng Qingwu's voice. It seemed to be uneasiness, solemnity, and hesitation. "He can be said to be a paradox of time and space but also not. What I can say is that Jiang Shangyu's existence has nothing to do with us, but his existence is also reasonable." "Reasonable?" Qin Weibai showed a very small but obvious sneer. "This is the only explanation. In Jiang Shangyu's current state, it is not surprising that anything happens to him. No matter what." Qin Weibai raised her eyebrows slightly. "Yes, anything." Feng Qingwu emphasized her tone. "For example, you may find that Jiang Shangyu can break through several realms overnight, and you may even find that Jiang Shangyu suddenly becomes stronger than His Majesty Li Tianlan, that Jiang Shangyu suddenly becomes extremely sharp and intelligent, and even becomes an unprecedented wise man. In a way, these are all possible, but such possibilities are two-sided. You may also find that Jiang Shangyu loses all his strength overnight, and that Jiang Shangyu's decision suddenly becomes as stupid as a stupid pig. You may even find that Jiang Shangyu suddenly becomes a woman. These are also possible." Qin Weibai was speechless for a long time. Her expression became a little strange. Jiang Shangyu suddenly became a woman. She knew that this was unlikely, but she couldn't help thinking about this possibility. It was incredible. This was absolutely unimaginable. This kind of change of different degrees may last for a long time, or the interval may be very short. What I want to say is that Jiang Shangyu's changes are not a disguise, but he is really changing because he himself is already chaotic now. The bedroom suddenly became dark for a moment. The light and even the energy of the stars in the pages were all extinguished. Qin Weibai heard an extremely clear sound of breaking. Absolute darkness appeared and disappeared abruptly. Feng Qingwu appeared in front of Qin Weibai again. Her body was still shrouded in light, but at this time the soft light suddenly became extremely messy. Every light seemed to be torn and cut by someone, and they were arranged in a very chaotic state. Feng Qingwu's breath was much weaker than before, but her body was still straight. "Take my gift for you," Feng Qingwu whispered. "It will only be good for you and it will not cause you any harm." Qin Weibai silently grasped the pages in her hand. She was silent for a long time and then whispered, "I have some questions." "Go ahead." Feng Qingwu always remained respectful and calm. "What is?" Qin Weibai just opened her mouth. At this moment she suddenly remembered something she heard when she saw Shenyuan Wushang, and also heard some of Shenyuan Wushang's murmurs. However, as soon as these thoughts appeared, they disappeared abruptly. The light in front of her suddenly shook. In the light, Feng Qingwu's face seemed to change dramatically. No one knew what she had done. Qin Weibai instantly forgot the question she wanted to ask, and her mind went blank. I can't answer that question. Feng Qingwu whispered, similarly you can't ask. Question, Qin Weibai was a little shocked. What was so serious? What did she want to ask her just now? She frowned tightly and was silent for a long time. Qin Weibai, who couldn't remember what she wanted to ask just now, suddenly changed the topic. Do you know calligraphers? Feng Qingwu paused and nodded slightly. Yes. Qin Weibai was extremely awkward. She knew that she had just forgotten a very important question, and the question about calligraphers could have echoed with the question she had forgotten so that she could notice something. But now she didn't know what she had forgotten, so the question was extremely abrupt. Are you also a calligrapher? Qin Weibai glanced at Feng Qingwu. I'm not. Feng Qingwu shook her head. I'm a dominator. It's not a code name, just a title. Dominator, Qin Weibai thought silently and suddenly felt that this title was much better than calligraphers. Compared with this title, the latter was simply too weak. You said that I will wake up and return. What will I be after I return? A dominator? Or a calligrapher? Or a doctor? Feng Qingwu was silent for a long time before she whispered, neither. If you wake up successfully, you will become. She hesitated for a full half a minute before she whispered, a devil. Qin Weibai was stunned for a long time before she said with a look of disgust, it sounds so bad. I don't like it. Feng Qingwu smiled helplessly. In fact, she knew very well that neither Li Tianlan nor Qin Weibai had a chance to really return completely. Because the end was close at hand. The only thing they could do now was to activate the real brand and wait for the next return. Feng Qingwu couldn't feel the end that was close at hand. Currently, there were only 3 people in the entire human race who could sense this. His Majesty of the Space-Time Corridor. The human emperor of the human palace. The god of war of the war god realm. So she didn't know how long it would be before the real end, but she knew that it was very close. Qin Weibai unconsciously rubbed the warm page in her hand, trying to fold the page little by little. The page kept getting smaller and smaller as it was folded. Getting smaller and smaller. Feng Qingwu watched quietly. Qin Weibai's expression changed little by little. Because the page was getting smaller with every fold. It wasn't getting smaller after folding, but the page was constantly disappearing as she folded it. With the last fold, the page completely disappeared in Qin Weibai's hand. This phenomenon, Qin Weibai had already understood without Feng Qingwu's explanation. She laughed a little self-deprecatingly, a little bitterly and a little pitifully. My gift has already gone to the other me, right? Feng Qingwu looked at her without saying a word. She wanted to answer but couldn't. So, Qin Weibai whispered, this is not a gift, or rather it's not my gift. Feng Qingwu still didn't speak. I see. Qin Weibai whispered, in your eyes I'm just a tool that can help Tianlan wake up, a tool that can help the other me wake up, right? It's not like that. Feng Qingwu whispered. She couldn't say the specific content, so this sentence was more like an extremely weak comfort. Qin Weibai smiled. She silently put on her clothes and looked at her empty palm. But so what, even so, her eyes were in a trance for a moment and she whispered, I still love him very much. Feng Qingwu sighed softly. You're very sad. Not really. Qin Weibai shook her head. She opened her palm, looked at it and whispered, it's just a little sad. I feel like a chess piece at your mercy. Not only me but also Tianlan and the other me, are they all chess pieces in your hands? No one is qualified to treat you and His Majesty as chess pieces. Feng Qingwu's tone was very firm. But Qin Weibai didn't speak. Her body stiffened without any warning, and then began to tremble slightly. Qin Weibai opened her eyes wide and stared at her empty palm. Her eyes were completely filled with an extremely strong fear in a very short time. Qin Weibai opened her palm. At this moment, it was also the moment when Xing Tian next door heard the extremely loud sound. The next second, Qin Weibai's somewhat trembling scream rang out because of fear. There's something in my hand. They're moving. There's something in my hand. With a strong scream, Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai with a complicated look and whispered, this is the biggest sin, this is blasphemy. You're blaspheming yourself. Chapter 1091. Qin Weibai didn't hear Feng Qingwu's voice. To be exact, she couldn't hear anything now. Intense fear swept through her will like a hurricane, and strong negative emotions completely drowned all her thoughts like a tsunami. At this moment, Qin Weibai's spiritual world was already falling apart. She couldn't care less about Feng Qingwu and just stared at her palm. The palm was slender, white and slender. It could be called an absolutely perfect pair of hands. But Qin Weibai could feel that there was something in her hand. It was not a microorganism like bacteria. Or rather, a different kind of microorganism. She could clearly feel that the invisible thing in her hand was coming alive little by little. Vaguely, she could even feel that the vitality of the thing in her hand was becoming stronger and stronger. They seemed to be tightly together, exploring, communicating and whispering on her palm. That kind of subtle thought activity was transmitted to Qin Weibai's consciousness very clearly, making her tremble all over. She suddenly raised her head, looked at Feng Qingwu and said blankly, "I really have something in my hand." "I believe you." Feng Qingwu nodded. The light shrouded her whole body, and her eyes lit up with a faint light. It was like the ray of an electronic instrument. Feng Qingwu's pupils contracted slightly, and her eyes fell on Qin Weibai's palm. The change in her pupils was very small. But such a small change made Feng Qingwu's sight magnify more than most of the microscopes on the earth. In such a sight, she could even clearly see the countless atoms and molecules that made up Qin Weibai's palm. She also saw the thing in Qin Weibai's palm. The thing that she called the greatest sin and blasphemy. Feng Qingwu stretched out her palm and gently rubbed Qin Weibai's fingertips. Her movement was slow and gentle like the wind. Qin Weibai was slightly stunned. "Do you still have something now?" Feng Qingwu asked with a smile. That weak but extremely clear breath disappeared. Qin Weibai felt that her palms had become clean again. She shook her head subconsciously, and didn't know what to say for a moment. "You should have a good rest." Feng Qingwu said softly, "Your mental state is becoming more and more unstable, just like the thing in your hand. I can say that if those little things are not discovered, the troubles that they will bring to us in the future will be beyond our imagination. Just like we said, this is the greatest sin and the greatest blasphemy." "Blasphemy?" Qin Weibai murmured to herself. She didn't seem to take it seriously. A strong sense of sleepiness rose and circled in her mind. Qin Weibai sat on the bed, and her essence, qi, and spirit gradually began to decline. "You should rest." Feng Qingwu said softly as she sat by the bed and hummed an ancient yet extremely gentle ballad. Her memory returned to her childhood. When she was very young, her mother would often hold her in her arms and gently hum this song. After so many meaningless years, Feng Qingwu never expected that she would sit by the bed and hum this song to coax her mother to sleep. "Mother?" Feng Qingwu looked at Qin Weibai, who was gradually falling asleep, with a complicated look in her eyes. In a sense, she was indeed his mother, but she was no longer his mother. Qin Weibai gradually fell asleep. Feng Qingwu stood up and looked down at her palm. The will of life and aura that Qin Weibai sensed were constantly recovering in her hands. If they could be regarded as living creatures, then if she released them now, their strength would even be no worse than Li Tianlan's. Feng Qingwu's expression became even more complicated and extremely cold. She looked at the creature in her hand and remained silent for a long time. This was Qin Weibai's ability. To put it bluntly, this was the power of a demon. But this was not the power of the neutral camp. The beginning of the Devil's Path was known as the Medical Examiner and belonged to the Order faction. Qin Weibai's existence was extremely special, and it was precisely because of this uniqueness that she became the first person in the history of the human race to reach the peak of the power path of the Order camp. So far, she was also the only person who stood at the peak of the Order camp and hadn't been assimilated by the Order camp. Even Li Tianlan had never achieved such uniqueness. Therefore, Qin Weibai became the first and only demon in the history of the human clan. What does a demon mean? If being omnipotent and omniscient was the clearest and most straightforward explanation for the Order camp, then to a certain extent, a demon was synonymous with omnipotence. Feng Qingwu looked at her palm. Qin Weibai wasn't crazy. What she said was true. There was indeed something in her hand. To be exact, there were two creatures. In Feng Qingwu's vision, which was magnified hundreds of thousands of times, the appearance of the two creatures was clear and real in her sight. They were two humanoid creatures. A man and a woman. They were creatures that were exactly the same as Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai. It was as if their bodies had suddenly shrunk countless times and become microorganisms. They were extremely small, but Feng Qingwu could clearly feel a strong sense of indifference and absolute order from them. Two similar or identical creatures were born in the hands of the demons of the Order camp countless years ago. And that time, it directly caused the anger of countless races in the entire neutral camp. His Majesty in the corridor of time and space controlled the Xianyuan sword with his own power, turning the nearly endless fortune of the human race into a sharp light that filled the sky. Wherever the tip of the Xianyuan sword pointed, the demon and all of its kind perished, dyeing the starry river red. That was a war that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It was also after that war that the demon's crime was defined as the greatest blasphemy in the history of the spacetime corridor. That was a rare concession from the Order camp. Since then, similar creatures had never appeared again. But now, such creatures like Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai were created by Qin Weibai herself. She had unintentionally blasphemed herself. There was an extremely violent heartbeat in her ears and it didn't stop. Every heartbeat was like thunder echoing in the sky. The loud sound exploded in everyone's ears, almost shattering everyone's consciousness. It was the heartbeat of the two creatures in Feng Qingwu's hands. Feng Qingwu closed her palms expressionlessly. In the void, the loud heartbeat that ordinary people couldn't detect suddenly quickened for a moment, and then completely stopped. Feng Qingwu walked out of the room and went directly to the room opposite the suite that belonged to Xing Tian and Shenyuan Wuxiang. Xing Tian's huge body was curled up, twitching and rolling in extreme pain. Feng Qingwu closed her palms, and the moment the heartbeat stopped, Xing Tian's body stiffened for a moment. All the pain seemed to disappear and he slowly calmed down. Feng Qingwu waved her hand slightly. At this moment she was no longer in charge. The whole world treated her as a doctor in her lies. A pure light bathed Xing Tian's body. Xing Tian's pale face instantly became ruddy, and his breath began to calm down. All the injuries and pain disappeared completely. Xing Tian slowly opened his eyes and saw the light floating in front of him. He couldn't see the scene in the light clearly, but he could feel a wisp of aura in the light. Xing Tian's expression changed slightly. He subconsciously knelt on one knee and said in a deep voice, "Greetings, Princess Royal." Feng Qingwu shook her head and glanced at him. "You're in good shape." "Yes," Xing Tian seemed to be still in shock. He recalled the extremely strong heartbeat that almost broke all his willpower and said with a trembling voice, "Just now, that's not something you should know." Feng Qingwu said lightly, "Keep it a secret." "Yes." Xing Tian nodded subconsciously. "Your calligraphy was disturbed. Qin Fangqing's death is directly related to Her Highness Qin Weibai. You wrote the cause of Qin Shi's death, but it was led to the cause of Qin Fangqing's death, which is related to Her Highness. You didn't die on the spot, which means that the interference was completely unconscious. That is to say, the other party didn't know about your existence." Feng Qingwu said lightly, "You continue to investigate the cause of Qin Shi's death, and pay attention to avoid some places that need to be avoided." Xing Tian nodded silently. He agreed with what Feng Qingwu said. Calligraphers mainly used the power of karma. Even if Qin Weibai and Li Tianlan hadn't woken up, Xing Tian couldn't write their karma by force. If their real imprints in silence revealed a little bit of aura, Xing Tian might die on the spot. If the real murderer who killed Qin Shi really knew about his and Shenyuan Wuxiang's existence and deliberately guided them, Xing Tian would have been a corpse by now. "Princess, if you do it yourself?" Xing Tian was silent and suddenly said with some hesitation, "I know who it is. Jianghu, just a polluted wretch." Feng Qingwu shook her head gently, "But there is a shadow mark on her, which is of a very high level. That mark is now attached to Jianghu's soul, and it seems to be in a state of chaos. If I do it myself, that mark will wake up, and the location of Miracle City may be directly exposed." Feng Qingwu said softly, "I'll leave this matter to you. For the time being, you don't have to rush to kill Jianghu. Help His Majesty stabilize the current passive situation first." Xing Tian nodded. In their eyes, everything in Miracle City was extremely backward, even a place that seemed to be destroyed at will. This place didn't seem important, but it was very important. After all, this was the real environment. Every step of Li Tianlan's development here was directly related to the degree of awakening of his real mark and the upper limit of his future. Shenyuan Wuxiang and Xing Tian were guides, but they were responsible for more than just guiding. When necessary, they were responsible for paving some roads for Li Tianlan. This was their duty. Feng Qingwu took a deep look at him and said lightly, "I'm leaving." Countless lights bloomed in front of Xing Tian. Xing Tian suddenly thought of something and said, "Princess." The light kept refracting in the bedroom and rushed into the messy snow outside the hotel. The night sky was quiet, and the world was silvery white. When all the light dissipated, Feng Qingwu's figure had completely disappeared from the bedroom. Chapter 1092. When her consciousness turned from sober to trance again, Qin Weibai found herself in a dream again. The garden that her consciousness had constructed in her dream had disappeared. Qin Weibai found that she seemed to be in a half-lying position in the air. She looked around blankly. The giant black tree full of metal fragments stood there quietly. It seemed to have been dead for a long time. Perhaps it was in the dream, so Qin Weibai could still feel that the dead tree still had a weak vitality. A drop of black juice flowed down from the trunk at a very slow speed, but the evil aura contained in it had long disappeared. Qin Weibai looked around silently and suddenly found that she did not see the shadow beside the giant black tree. She was slightly shocked and subconsciously wanted to sit up from a half-lying position. When she waved her arms, her palms seemed to touch something cold and soft. Qin Weibai was stunned and looked around her. Only then did she find that the shadow she was looking for was close at hand. However, the shadow of Li Tianlan was even dimmer, almost completely transparent, and disappeared. Now she seemed to be lying in the arms of the shadow, but if she did not look carefully, Qin Weibai could not find his existence at all. Qin Weibai stood up. In the dream, she observed the darkness around her with the clearest consciousness. The flying snow, the sun, the garden, everything disappeared. It wasn't until the moment she stood up that she realized that it wasn't just the things she had constructed. Even the giant black tree beside her seemed to be slowly disappearing. The giant tree began to become transparent, and the shadow beside her was also becoming dimmer and dimmer. There was a kind of emptiness around that made people feel extremely depressed. It seemed to be black all around. But it also seemed that there was no color. Not only color, but there was nothing here. Sound, light, perception, and even space and time, everything was quickly fading away. Qin Weibai wanted to move forward, but suddenly found that she could not move at all. Or rather, it was not that she could not move. Because there was no space here. There was no front or back, up or down, left or right. In the void of nothing, the movement of moving forward did not exist at all. Gradually, Qin Weibai even lost the idea of moving forward. The giant black tree disappeared quickly. Li Tianlan's shadow also disappeared completely. Qin Weibai felt that she seemed to be disappearing little by little in the dream. Everything in the world seemed to be coming to an end. This kind of ending was not death, but true, purest nothingness. Qin Weibai gradually became a little confused and lost. Her consciousness seemed to be completely trapped in this empty void, quietly feeling the changes in this void. Time seemed to pass in an instant. Qin Weibai was trapped here in silence. She did not know what was going on, nor did she bother to think about it. She did not even know who she was. She seemed to have become a part of the void, an eternal existence in the illusory dreamland. Until a glimmer of light appeared in front of her. This glimmer was so faint that it was difficult for the naked eye to capture it. Not to mention the naked eye, even the most advanced microscope would find it difficult to see this glimmer of light. However, he was surrounded by the most extreme nothingness. Therefore, no matter how dim this ray of light was, it was still a pure ray of light. It was extremely eye-catching in this void. Qin Weibai watched all this quietly. The ray of light in the void began to become brighter and brighter. But there was no space around it. All the light was compressed into a point. More and more light began to produce various reactions in the extreme compression. The mass of the light was getting larger and heavier, but the volume never changed. The surrounding nothingness remained unchanged. It was another long time. It was like a second but also like a whole era. The light that had been constantly compressed seemed to be completely compressed to the extreme. Without a sound, the ray of light exploded in the empty void. It was the most terrifying and surging explosion. It was silent, but in an instant, it burned with a strong light that no one could look directly at. The strong light began to spread. So the void was disappearing. Space appeared. The strong light spread in the space where it appeared, and the distance was getting longer and longer. But the order of each ray of light was completely different. So time also appeared. The time and space that appeared in the beginning were extremely unstable, sometimes fast and sometimes slow, sometimes big and sometimes small. There was no rule and it had been in the most chaotic state. But the explosion continued and it was still spreading. The inner space continued to collapse in the center of the explosion, but the explosion continued to expand the surrounding space at the most extreme speed. Qin Weibai could clearly feel the blazing heat that could evaporate everything spreading with the space formed by the explosion. The temperature was extremely hot, and the speed of expansion with the explosion was also extremely fast. Some subtle and single basic substances were also becoming more and more numerous with the explosion. Only these basic substances could exist in such a high temperature. Basic particles such as electrons, photons, neutrinos, and elementary particles extended infinitely to all parts of the space. The explosion was still going on or it would continue. The initial scorching temperature began to gradually decrease, and the surrounding density began to drop rapidly. The changes in the environment affected the basic existence form of matter. So atoms, atomic nuclei, and molecules began to appear gradually, and began to recombine into gas in the area after the explosion. The explosion had spread to an infinite distance, but it was still constantly eroding the surrounding nothingness. The space was getting bigger and bigger, and time and space began to stabilize. The initial gas slowly condensed into a nebula. The nebula was changing, evolving, and slowly forming all kinds of stars and galaxies. The original panorama of the world appeared little by little in Qin Weibai's vague consciousness, grand and magnificent. Time seemed to be accelerated countless times, and also seemed to be slowed down countless times. The space was constantly expanding, and her vision was getting farther and farther, so the so-called time completely lost its meaning of existence. She watched the nothingness become space, and the space produced by the explosion was expanding endlessly. She saw the sky full of nebula turn into starlight, and the world was being born little by little. The galaxy rotated around her, and began to reveal the truth of the world little by little. She seemed to be standing at the center of the whole world, watching the whole process of the world from nothing to something. It was like a chapter of the creation of the world. Qin Weibai's consciousness began to recover little by little. She flew far away to an unknown place, and her vision began to return. Hundreds of millions of galaxies revolved around her, forming an incomparably complex pattern. A warm glimmer rose from her side. The light continued to combine, and finally became an extremely thick page. This was a gift from Feng Qingwu. Qin Weibai thought for a long time before she understood what it was. It did not return to the master of Samsara Palace, but appeared in her dream, or appeared in the depths of her consciousness. A vague feeling began to reverberate in her consciousness. At this moment, Qin Weibai's consciousness completely woke up from the trance. She silently looked at the slowly moving starry sky in front of her and remained silent for a long time. In this starry sky, she once again felt the existence of Li Tianlan's virtual shadow and the giant black tree beside Li Tianlan. She could even feel the giant black tree constructed by her own consciousness. That garden. They did not disappear. Instead, with the spread of the explosion, she did not know which corner of the world they had drifted to. There was a black void under her feet. The coldness of the void was completely washed away by the energy of the stars in the chapter of creation. She was surrounded by warmth. Qin Weibai looked ahead. The nearest place in front of her was a dark planet, rotating around the nearest star. Qin Weibai vaguely understood something. Her so-called return and so-called awakening seemed to be a search. In the starry sky of the dream, she silently looked at the world in the dream. Countless galaxies, countless star clusters, and an almost eternal distance. What she wanted to do was to find Li Tianlan's phantom again in this world, find that tree and find that garden. They still existed. They existed in a corner of a planet in a galaxy of a star cluster in this world of the dream. Maybe when she saw Li Tianlan again, their consciousness could be completely synchronized. And such a search was equivalent to looking for a certain elementary particle in a gravel in the endless universe. The most important thing was, how could she cross this seemingly endless distance? She needed tools. She needed a spaceship. A thought flashed through Qin Weibai's mind subconsciously. She wanted a spaceship at this moment. The space was shaking. Without any warning, a huge ram appeared in Qin Weibai's field of vision. Then, a majestic starry sky warship appeared silently in front of Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai looked at the scene in front of her with a dull face. She could clearly feel that this spaceship appeared in her dream with her thoughts. That feeling was so appropriate and there was nothing strange about it. Qin Weibai had no idea what kind of technology and materials were needed to build a spaceship. But as she imagined, this spaceship really appeared. It should be a flying saucer. Qin Weibai continued to think about some UFO images that were circulating in various countries. So the huge battleship kept changing and finally became a flying saucer in line with Qin Weibai's expectations. I need to be faster, Qin Weibai murmured to herself. No, the fastest? The flying saucer disappeared without any warning. Without any warning, it completely disappeared from Qin Weibai's sight. The corner of Qin Weibai's mouth twitched subconsciously. In her consciousness, there seemed to be something flying through the starry sky at a speed far faster than the speed of light. She knew it was the flying saucer. It flew away. The point was that it didn't take her with it. One flying saucer is not enough, Qin Weibai continued to think. As she thought, endless flying saucers began to appear without warning. They occupied Qin Weibai's vision and almost covered the entire starry sky that Qin Weibai could see in an instant. Countless flying saucers moved in different directions in Qin Weibai's mind, forming one fleet after another. Qin Weibai's eyes were shining and she was in high spirits. She finally discovered what kind of ability she had in this dream. This was her dream. In her dream she couldn't find Li Tianlan, but under most conditions she had almost omnipotent ability. And such an ability, if explained in the most straightforward way, was not difficult. There was a word that could perfectly explain this ability. This word. It was called Dream Come True. Chapter 1093. The closer it was to the Spring Festival, the colder it got in Jianghu State. It was said that this year's cold wave was extremely rare in Jianghu State for decades. The cold wave went all the way south from Snow Country, swept through the northeast of Jianghu State, swept through Yuzhou, and again swept through most of Dongshan and Yan and Zhao with heavy rain and snow. In the places with the heaviest rain and snow, there was even a small-scale snow disaster. The snowstorm in Qingzhou was neither too heavy nor too light. The snowflakes drifted lazily in the sky, and the spotless white dots dotted the entire city. When night fell, the drifting snowflakes in the sky looked a little cold under the lights of the city, but it was also beautiful. I'm really defeated by this damn weather. I'm freezing to death. At the headquarters of Plain Trading, He Yishui muttered helplessly as he walked out of the elevator when it was time to get off work. Silver high-heeled shoes, black cotton stockings, leather shorts, and a white tight-fitting sweater wrapped around her exquisite figure. As the president of Plain Trading, He Yishui perfectly interpreted the unique charm of a mature woman. When she went out, got in the car, got out of the car, and entered the company, she hated being fat the most. So even in the snowy weather of -5 or 6 degrees, she still wore thin clothes. It was fine at home and in the company, but the short distance from the lobby to the parking lot after she got out of the elevator was the most unbearable. You're wearing too little. In the gentle and light voice, the woman walking beside He Yishui showed a very charming smile on her face. She was dressed much more plainly than all the female employees of Plain Trading. She wore a white extended down jacket and sneakers that were not sexy but very comfortable. Her hair was tied up casually and she wore no makeup. She was so pure as if she had not been contaminated by the glitz and dust of the city at all. When she approached the door of the lobby, the cold wind whistled. She put on the hood of the down jacket, covering most of her beautiful face. She turned around to look at He Yishui. He Yishui had already put on a light-colored cashmere coat, but his body was still shivering. It was obvious that he was still extremely cold. Do you want me to lend you my clothes? She smiled softly. Forget it, I can't afford it. If you catch a cold later, won't I be guilty? He Yishui hugged her shoulders and laughed. Let's go. Let's go to my house tonight. My parents said that they won't eat until you arrive. They've already picked up Tide. He Yishui pushed her slightly faster. The employees of Sushi Trading who hadn't had time to go home saw the two of them standing there. When they greeted Mr. He, they didn't forget to greet her, who was being pushed away by He Yishui. The way he addressed Manager Li was filled with obvious intimacy and respect. She smiled in response to every employee who passed by her. Her smile was gentle, peaceful, and sincere. The two of them jogged into the parking lot one after another. A black Audi with an extremely eye-catching license plate, which did not have a powerful aura, was parked next to He Yishui's car. A young man who did not look aggressive at all and looked extremely honest greeted the two of them in a somewhat reserved manner. President He, Manager Li, Chairman He asked me to pick you up. Standing in front of Audi, the administrative manager of Plain Water Trading, Li Mutong, frowned slightly. Her face was covered by a hat, so her expression was a little blurry. However, He Yishui seemed to read her best friend's mind. She chuckled and said, "It's not like we don't have a car. We don't need him to be nice. You can go back. We'll drive straight away." Without waiting for the driver to reply, she opened the door of her car and stuffed Li Mutong in. Then she smiled and sat in the driver's seat. The heater in the car was turned up to the maximum, and He Yishui calmed down for a while. She took off her coat again and looked at Li Mutong, who was silent in the passenger seat. Suddenly she laughed and said, "Hey, you don't seem to be going to our house recently. Even if you do, you're in a hurry. My parents have asked me a few times whether you and Tong Tong have quarreled. Why doesn't Tong Tong bring little Tide to play anymore? From what I can see, they are much more attentive towards you than they are towards me. Miss, you haven't been going to our house recently. It's not because of my brother, right?" "No." Li Mutong smiled and said, "I made it clear to second brother He last time. I've always treated him as my brother." "Tut tut," He Yishui sighed softly. She wanted to say that her second brother's infatuation was pitiful, but thinking of Li Mutong's character, she hesitated and said nothing in the end. The He family was far from being a wealthy family in Jianghu State. Even in Dongshan, it couldn't be said to be a first-tier or second-tier wealthy family. But in a small city like Qingzhou, the He family was definitely one of the richest families. In He Yishui's generation there were 3 siblings. The eldest brother's family had been overseas for a long time. He Yishui managed the family business, and the second brother He Yihong became the pillar of the He family. He Yihong's career was not very smooth before. But in the past 2 years there were frequent personnel changes in Dongshan, which affected all the counties and cities. He Yihong took some action and seemed to be on the rise. More than 2 years ago he was just a non-director and low-ranking deputy mayor of Qingzhou. 2 years ago he coincidentally became a director of Qingzhou. About a month ago he became the deputy speaker of Qingzhou. The mayor of Qingzhou was old and would probably retire tomorrow, so He Yihong had a great chance to be promoted. Perhaps because of this, He Yihong's uneasy heart seemed to have a little more confidence. About 3 months ago when Li Mutong brought her daughter to his house, He Yihong drank a little too much and expressed his feelings to Li Mutong in a very subtle way. He Yishui was well aware of his second brother's feelings. When he was still the deputy mayor he saw Li Mutong for the first time, and he was already deeply in love with her. Yihong was 39 years old this year. He had a marriage in his early years, but his wife died of illness 10 years ago and they didn't have any children. Perhaps because he missed his wife too much, He Yihong had been alone for 10 years, and he had always taken good care of his wife's family. He Yihong might have made mistakes during his more than 10 years of official career, but he had never violated the rules. He was not lustful for women and he never had any scandals. The wealth from the water trade was also destined to keep him away from financial problems. He worked conscientiously, had a modest personality, and had an elegant demeanor. He might not be a perfect man but no one could say that he was a gentleman and no one could object to that. In He Yishui's heart, his second brother was very simple in love. When he first met Li Mutong, he had been suppressing his love for her. He Yishui had asked him the reason and his answer was very honest. I'm so many years older than her, so it's not suitable for me. She might not like me. How should I put it? I like a girl like her very much, but I always feel that I don't deserve a girl like her. For more than 2 years He Yihong had been suppressing his feelings. Even when Li Mutong became a single mother, He Yihong's attitude towards her didn't change at all. Instead he secretly spent more time and effort on her. An orphan and a widowed mother. It was easy to imagine the difficulties that the mother and daughter had encountered in life. The He family had always guessed that Li Mutong was a daughter from a wealthy family. It was only because of her child that she had completely broken up with her family. Therefore many times even though she appeared to be very strong, her lack of social experience still made her somewhat distressed. He Yihong watched silently and secretly blocked all the troubles for her without batting an eyelid. In the past 2 years, there were more than 10 outstanding young men who didn't mind her bringing her child to court her. He Yihong didn't stop them. He only gave a warning to those who pestered and caused trouble for the mother and daughter. The situation in Dongshan in the past 2 years was extremely complicated. He Yihong, who had an excellent reputation, slowly showed his brilliance. It wasn't until He Yihong was sure that he had a bright future that he found a suitable opportunity to carefully and tactfully express his feelings to Li Mutong. However, the response he received was the same as the other suitors. Perhaps it was also different, because Li Mutong was also very tactful. She said that she had always treated He Yihong as her brother. But no matter what, in essence, her answer was still a rejection, and there was no room for negotiation. From then on, Li Mutong rarely went to the He family's door. Today was He Yishui's mother's birthday. She tried her best to persuade Li Mutong, and even got her parents to bring little Tai to the He family's house in advance. Only then did she manage to convince Li Mutong to attend the He family's family dinner. If she still made fun of her second brother at this time, her best friend would probably get angry. He Yishui treasured her bestie Li Mutong very much. Could even be said that she treasured her the most. She had never put in a good word for her second brother in front of her. It didn't matter whether Li Mutong was a daughter from a wealthy family or not. She knew one thing very clearly. Even if her second brother didn't mind that Li Mutong was a single mother, even if the entire He family including their parents were willing to accept them. But Li Mutong wouldn't accept it. The identity of Li Chaoxi's father had always been a mystery. This was Li Mutong's taboo. Every time He Yishui brought it up indirectly, all he got was silence. At the beginning, the silence was fragile, lost, and even a little wronged. But the silence would slowly change as time went by. After 2 years of silence, Li Mutong didn't feel fragile and lost anymore. What was left was an extremely quiet and indifferent feeling. This Li Mutong was the most beautiful. As calm as still water. This Li Mudong was like waking up from an ancient painting. The clock forgot to sway and the flowers forgot to bloom. She was so quiet, like a drop of ink in an ancient painting, so quiet that it wouldn't change for thousands of years. She waited quietly and she persisted quietly. All the hustle and bustle had nothing to do with her. In the ordinary world, she bloomed peacefully, like a flower that didn't attract dust. Yishui started the car. He sighed softly in his heart. Perhaps waiting for her daughter to grow up had become the biggest motivation for Li Mudong. But the insistence in her heart didn't show any sign of loosening. This insistence was so stubborn that it instinctively refused all the men to get close to her. That adorable child, that touch of lovesickness, seemed to have become her everything for the rest of her life unknowingly. The car slowly drove out of the parking lot. The wind and snow were flying in the night sky of Jianghu. The new snow was bright and the rest of her life was boundless. Yishui was silent for a while and then said softly, "Don't worry. Today's family dinner doesn't mean anything else. It's just that my mother misses you." Li Mudong was also quietly looking at the flying snow outside the car window. Her eyes were a little blurred. After a while, she softly answered. Chapter 1094. The snow danced in the wind. When the car entered an old villa area in Jianghu, the villa area was already brightly lit. Yishui put on his coat again and ran into a villa with Li Mudong in tow. As soon as he entered the door, he said with a trembling smile, "I'm freezing to death." The heater in the villa was on full blast. It was as warm as spring. An elderly couple who looked to be in their 60s were sitting on the sofa watching television. When they saw her daughter and Li Mudong enter, the graceful and kind old woman stood up with a smile. However, the first thing she said was not to greet her daughter. "Tong Tong, you're here. Sit and warm up for a while. Dinner will be served soon." Li Mudong smiled and greeted her aunt. She looked at the old man beside the old woman and greeted him uncle. The old man's hair was already a little white, and he looked like he had been through a lot. Although the He family was not big, the old man who founded the plain water trade when he was young was a legendary figure in Jianghu. In his old age there were traces of a lifetime of hard work on his face. The old man did not seem to care much about Li Mudong. He just nodded at her casually. All his thoughts were on the baby sitting in his arms. The baby who had just celebrated her first birthday was a girl. She had small hands and feet and wore pretty little clothes. She kept reaching out her little hands in the old man's arms, as if she wanted to grab the old man's beard. The old man smiled and dodged her. From time to time, he would carefully pinch the girl's little face. The little girl seemed to be a little angry. She opened her little mouth and wanted to bite the old man's finger. The old man laughed out loud and even his eyes narrowed. Li Mudong looked at this scene with a smile. She reached out her hands and said gently, "Tide, come, mommy will carry you." The girl turned her head in the old man's arms. When she saw her mother, she struggled to get down from the old man's arms. The old man laughed and scolded, "Little girl, you only know how to look for your mommy. Did you forget that grandpa fed you delicious food just now?" The girl ignored him. She opened her little hands and called her mommy softly with a tender and cute voice. Li Mudong seemed to melt into this tender voice. She squatted down and opened her hands slightly. The girl climbed down from the old man's knees and walked to Li Mudong with a little stagger. She fell into her arms. "Uncle, Auntie, I'm sorry for the trouble." Li Mudong carried her daughter and looked apologetic. "What words?" The old man smiled and waved his hand. "Tong Tong, don't say that. You don't treat us as family. You haven't been coming here often and your aunt has been talking about little Tide. There were a few times when she couldn't help but want to see it. I was afraid that you would be annoyed, so I kept stopping her." The old man's name was very compatible with Jianghu City. His name was Jianghu. His life of more than 60 years could be considered bumpy and full of ups and downs. In the end, he had relatively good achievements. The old couple was very satisfied with their current life, but what made Jianghu most regretful was the problem of the family's heirs. 2 sons and a daughter. His eldest son had a happy family, but he was abroad all year round, so Jianghu didn't see him often. The second son's family used to be quite good, but his daughter-in-law passed away early and didn't leave behind any children. As for his daughter, he didn't have high hopes for his son-in-law when he first got married. As expected, they divorced after a few years of marriage. They also didn't have any children. In such a big villa, it was better at night. During the day, when the children went to work, only the old couple and the servants were left in the house. It was cold and indescribably boring. As for Li Mudong, the old couple was very fond of her. This child was generous and quiet, and she had a peace and quiet that stood aloof from worldly affairs. She was also very capable in her work. Now, although her position was only the administrative manager of plain water trading, her salary was actually comparable to that of the company's vice president. If it wasn't for her resistance to promotion, He Yishui even wanted to promote her to vice president. At the very least, she couldn't escape from the position of assistant to the president and director of a department. He Qingzhou and his wife loved Li Mutong almost as if she was their own daughter, even though they knew that she didn't get pregnant before. Now that they had Li Mutong, who was not their biological daughter, their love life was also bumpy. The old couple didn't know how to feel. Madame He even hated Tide's bastard father to the core. Whenever she talked about him, she would be filled with anger. However, when she faced Li Mutong, she felt even more pity for her. During the year after Li Mutong's pregnancy and postpartum, although they hired a nanny, Madame He would always run to Li Mutong's place and take care of her meticulously. It was also during this process that Li Mutong seemed to have slowly integrated into the He family. Li Mutong looked at the smiling old lady beside her and chuckled. "Auntie, happy birthday. I've prepared a gift for you. I'll give it to you during dinner." "You child, don't be so polite. The fact that you're here is the best gift." The old lady pulled Li Mutong to her side and smiled. She seemed to have thought of something and lowered her voice. "Silly girl, if you feel wronged in the future, just tell me, okay? I've scolded your second brother harshly. If he says anything else, just tell me and I'll scold him for you. Little Tide is my and your uncle's baby now. We're feeling empty after not seeing her for so long. You can't be so distant. If that's the case." He Qingzhou nodded and smiled. Yihong is so impatient and doesn't know his limits. "Tong Tong, uncle and auntie will stand up for you. If we don't like him, we don't like him. It's okay if you don't become our daughter-in-law. We're family. If you don't bring little Tide to our house in the future, we'll be angry. You hate Yihong, but you can't be disdainful of us too, right?" "That's not what I mean." Li Mutong shook her head and smiled softly. "I don't hate second brother, but I've always seen him as an older brother. I don't have any other thoughts and I don't want to think about that. The only thing I want now is to raise Tide successfully." Okay. He Qingzhou nodded with a smile. They really didn't have any other thoughts. They were very satisfied with Li Mutong, and they liked Li Chaoshi from the bottom of their hearts. If Li Chaoshi could become their daughter-in-law, they would agree with both hands and feet. But they didn't have that fate, so there was no need to force it. The He family of Qingzhou wasn't a rich family, but not every rich family could be so magnanimous. "Let's not talk about this. Today is your auntie's birthday and she made a lot of dishes. Eat more later. We won't drink for a family banquet." He Qingzhou smiled and looked at his daughter. "Call your second brother and ask him why he's not back yet. Only now do you remember me? I thought you've forgotten about your daughter." He Yishui, who had been teasing Li Chaoshi, said unhappily. He took out his phone and dialed He Yihong's number. The call went through quickly, but the other side of the phone only said a few words before the call was hung up. He Yishui frowned slightly and was silent for a while. "What's wrong?" He Qingzhou asked casually. "Second brother said that there's an emergency council meeting in the city. I'm afraid he won't be back until very late today." He Yishui said slowly. He Qingzhou's expression changed. He frowned slightly, but he didn't say anything. The atmosphere in the villa suddenly became tense. Li Mutong hugged her daughter and patted her back gently. The child was lying on her shoulder obediently. She seemed to be having a good time in the afternoon, and now she was showing signs of falling asleep. "Is it because of me, second brother?" Li Mutong felt that the atmosphere was not right, so she said with a smile. She remembered He Yihong's driver in the parking lot of Plain Water Trade. Everything seemed to be a coincidence. "Ignore him. We'll eat by ourselves." The old madam snorted and patted Li Mutong's head with a smile. "It's not like that." He Qingzhou shook his head solemnly and sighed. It seemed that he was afraid that Li Mutong would misunderstand. He smiled again and looked at her. "Tong Tong, don't think too much. It's really not like that. We're all family. Let me make it clear. From this year to next year, not only Qingzhou but the entire East Mountain, the situation is very complicated." He raised a finger and pointed up. "The fight at the top is fierce. I know. They have to prepare to take over." He Shui added. He Qingzhou smiled and shook his head. At their level, it was impossible to come into contact with the real news at the top. He Yihong, the deputy speaker of Qingzhou, couldn't. He Qingzhou couldn't and He Yishui couldn't. But taking over, He Qingzhou shook his head subconsciously. He really couldn't see the situation at the top, but he also knew that it was very likely not the case. Although he wasn't sure that Li Huaqing would be re-elected, At least he could see that there seemed to be no strong person who had the possibility of reaching the top. It was already December. In the extremely special meeting some time ago, no strong person was elected as the deputy minister of the military. It seemed to indicate something very clear. Taking over seems to be unlikely. He Qingzhou shook his head. But you saw the news today. The prime minister's death. As he spoke, he shook his head and didn't finish his sentence. He seemed to be keeping this topic a secret. Yi Shui was startled. She widened her eyes in astonishment. Dad, are you serious? Are you saying? I didn't say anything. He Qingzhou glared at her. Yi Shui was silent for a while before saying softly, the prime minister died of a cerebral hemorrhage. It was announced this afternoon. There's nothing strange about it. He Qingzhou couldn't help but laugh. If you could see something strange about it, would you still be here? Yi Shui frowned and said softly, Dad, are you saying that there are other reasons for the prime minister's death? Then isn't second brother? He Hong was very close to the governor of East Mountain. This was also the reason why he had been promoted in the past 2 years. The current governor of East Mountain had once served as the deputy governor of the Southwest Province. He could be said to be Qin Fangqing's old subordinate in the past. If the cause of the prime minister's death, He Shui took a deep breath and shook his head subconsciously. How is this possible? Who has the guts to do that? I don't believe it. What does it matter if we believe it or not? Let's see what happens next. In the past 2 years, there have been a lot of changes in personnel in Jianghu State. We can't see through the mystery, but I think the southeast and the central plains have been severely suppressed. Now, you know Tiannan, right? He Shui nodded subconsciously. I heard that Xinyuan City is very beautiful, but I haven't been there. Li Mutong's body trembled slightly. He subconsciously hugged his daughter and didn't speak. Tiannan, Xinyuan City? He Qingzhou laughed self-deprecatingly. It is said that the young big shot in Tiannan is going to show his strength before the election. It seems that he has always had a bad relationship with the prime minister. This time, who can say for sure? Once that person makes a move, it will affect all aspects. Qingzhou seems to be very big, but in his eyes, let alone Qingzhou, the whole East Mountain may be directly taken over by him. This is what it means to make waves with one turn of the hand. Your second brother is in a difficult situation now. The hall fell into silence for a while. Wang Yuedong's eyes were a little absent-minded. After more than 2 years in this small town where it was impossible to get too much information from the upper class, she heard news about him again. He was the only man she had. He was the biological father of little Tide. She stood stiffly in the warm hall in a daze. For a moment she seemed to have lost her soul. I have other things to do these 2 days, so I don't have much time to write. Originally, yesterday, today, and tomorrow the 3 chapters should be a big chapter of more than 10,000 words. I have no choice but to write them separately. Chapter 1095. After dinner, the snow in Qingzhou became heavier. The entire community was covered with snow. Li Chaoshi had fallen asleep in Li Mutong's arms. Yi Shui picked up a small piece of cake and put it into his mouth. He looked at Li Mutong, who was chatting with his mother, and smiled. Don't leave tonight. It's so late and it's snowing heavily. I think it's frozen outside. Okay. Mrs. He nodded with a smile. Tong Tong, stay here. We can talk tonight. It's convenient for you to go to work with Yi Shui tomorrow. Let Chaoshi play with me for a day. I can't get enough of this little girl. If I go to work with her, I'll be at least half a day late. Li Mutong looked at Yi Shui with a smile. She didn't object. In the past 2 years she had been really familiar with Yi Shui. She had lived here for half a year before and after childbirth. It's my own business. What are you afraid of? Who dares to deduct my salary? Just tell me and I'll help you. Mrs. He smiled and asked the nanny to clean up the room. She specially asked the nanny to put a new quilt on the crib. Wang Yuetong got up and followed her. She carefully put her sleeping daughter on the new crib and let the nanny take care of her. Then she returned to the living room. After the door was closed, the nanny bent down and pinched Li Chaoshi's little face lovingly. Then she turned around and found a new bag of milk powder and a bottle. Li Mutong often lived in Yi Shui's house. The guest room next to Yi Shui's bedroom had basically become Li Mutong's room. Therefore there were many things in the room. After preparing the things that could comfort Li Chaoshi when she woke up, the nanny sat on a chair and turned on the TV in the room. She adjusted the volume to the lowest channel and continued to watch the TV series she was watching. The light from the TV was hazy. In silence, the little princess who was sleeping soundly frowned. At the center of her eyebrows, a 7-colored speck of light suddenly lit up. It was a speck of light that was smaller than a grain of rice. Normally it would not be noticed at all. However, as the speck of light shone, a rainbow luster began to fluctuate between Li Chaoxi's brows. A weak but incomparably sharp light enveloped Li Chaoxi's petite body almost instantly. At the same time, a ray of pure white light began to distort and change in front of the crib, finally turning into an illusory figure shrouded in gentle light. The television in the room was still on. The nanny looked at the screen with relish, unaware of what was happening around her. Feng Qingwu lowered her head quietly and looked at Li Chaoxi, who was sleeping soundly with her arms spread open. Then she looked at the blurry layer of light that enveloped her body and was stunned. The seven-colored radiance that was growing sharper and sharper silently calmed down. The light seemed to hesitate for a moment before it slowly retreated back into Li Chaoxi's forehead. Li Chaoxi stared deeply at the weak spot of light between the baby's eyebrows, a little dazed. In the ancient bronze hall in the space-time corridor, when His Majesty said that doomsday was coming, she felt that her escape route was here. She knew of Li Chaoxi's existence. She knew it the moment Li Chaoxi was born. She used to be the youngest daughter of the first His Majesty. And now, Li Chaoxi was the eldest daughter of Li Tianlan. Somehow, there was already some kind of connection between them. But now, when she saw the spot of light between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows, she finally understood how perfect her escape route was. Tens of thousands of years ago or even longer, this spot of light had appeared on her forehead. It only disappeared when she reached the peak. To a certain extent, Feng Qingwu's achievements today had a lot to do with this spot of light. This was the mark of King Wei. He had reincarnated several times and it had been a long time since then. It was hard to tell where King Wei had come from. When countless lost memories could no longer be found, perhaps even His Majesty in the corridor of time and space would not remember how King Wei had appeared. But there was no doubt that in the beginning, King Wei was one of the most important cornerstones of the entire neutral camp. What was a cornerstone? The so-called cornerstone was the power that could support all the paths of the entire camp. King Wei was the head of the 4 divine artifacts in the space-time corridor. It was more important than the picture of all worlds, the Tower of Human Emperor, and the Shenyuan sword. No one could remember what King Wei was called in the beginning. According to vague records, the title of King Wei was bestowed by the first His Majesty, who was also Feng Qingwu's father, and it was unanimously recognized by all the major races of the neutral camp. In other words, King Wei was the King Wei of the neutral camp, and its title was recognized by all the forces of the neutral camp. In the spacetime corridor, the title represented more than just power and status. Behind each title was the accumulation of the fate of the human race and the countless races of the neutral camp. This was one of the most important powers of the human race. In the blasphemy war that lasted for nearly 1,000 years, His Majesty in the spacetime corridor used the Shenyuan sword as his weapon, transforming the endless fate of the human race into a sharp blade that covered the sky and killed the demons of the order camp with one strike. To a certain extent, this was a display of his power to the extreme. King Wei was the cornerstone of the camp, and with the addition of the title, its mark naturally had an extraordinary significance. The light dot between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows was the mark of King Wei, and it was also the mark that had appeared on Feng Qingwu's eyebrows. This mark had a name that everyone in the spacetime corridor envied. It was called the neutral halo. The neutral halo was connected to the host's bloodline, and even had a deep connection to the host's soul. To the creatures of the other camp, this was a heavenly punishment that was difficult to escape, but to the creatures of the neutral camp, it was a gift from the gods that they dreamed of. This was something that was extremely rare in the entire spacetime corridor. The effect of the so-called neutral halo was also clear and domineering. It greatly increased one's talent, physical quality, and luck. The so-called neutral halo, if translated into a term that everyone in Miracle City could understand, could also be called a halo. The protagonist halo. This was the real protagonist halo. The formation of similar halos required a cornerstone figure in the camp to separate a wisp of his soul with his own providence. But how many cornerstone characters were there in the entire spacetime corridor? King Wei was not yet complete. To separate and form a neutral halo, he would have to pay a huge price. It was clear that he favored Li Chaoxi and even spoiled him. What an enviable little guy. Feng Qingwu tapped Li Chaoxi's eyebrows and smiled. A strand of 7-colored radiance twined around Feng Qingwu's fingertip and fused into her flesh. Feng Qingwu's shadow became more and more illusory, almost completely transparent. Big sister will be staying here for a long time. From now on, it is me and I will be you. When you reach my level, we can only separate. Little Tide, do you agree? Feng Qingwu froze. She looked at the baby's face and asked softly, Little Tide, who was sleeping soundly, moved her little mouth. She stuck her little finger into her mouth and sucked on it. Big sister, take it as a yes. Feng Qingwu smiled. She glanced at the dot of light between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows and asked softly, "What does King Wei think?" The dot of light flickered silently. Feng Qingwu could vaguely feel a part of the energy from the dot of light fly out from between Li Chaoxi's eyebrows, pass through the villa, fly into the night sky, and float in the direction of Serenity Province. Feng Qingwu silently felt all this. After a while, she reached out her hand and touched Li Chaoxi's eyebrows. An illusory ray of light that seemed like it would dissipate at any moment blossomed between her fingers, slowly landing on the tiny dot of light. The dot of light began to shine, and the rainbow light slowly wrapped around the illusory light. Feng Qingwu pursed her lips and smiled, then said softly, "I can't stay here yet. I'll reserve a place first. That way, even if I die in the final war, I can still return here and embark on the path of return." She bowed slightly to the dot of light and said softly, "Thank you, Uncle King Wei." The rainbow light flashed on Li Chaoxi's forehead, illuminating her small body. Feng Qingwu touched Li Chaoxi's little hand again and smiled, "Thank you too, little sister," or "little sister." Li Chaoxi turned over. Under the dim light as he turned over, a shadow appeared on the wall. But it was not Li Chaoxi's shadow. Instead, it was a slender, hazy, and dreamy figure. That was Feng Qingwu's shadow. Feng Qingwu, who left her shadow on Li Chaoxi, looked through the snow outside the window and looked at the night sky. Her gaze seemed to have traversed an unimaginable distance in an instant, and she saw the battlefield once again. Just like what His Majesty had said. The human race no longer had a big picture. In the countless galaxies and galaxies that could be clearly seen, wars were erupting everywhere. Billions of interstellar fleets roared and roared. Battlefields covered the starry sky, the planets, the heavens, and the earth. It was not in a certain region. It was in the entire galaxy. The black ocean swept through hundreds of battlefields, bringing with it a monstrous sword light that charged forward on countless battlefields that were measured in units of light years. That dot of golden blood burned in the void, emitting a light that could shatter the starry sky, tearing apart battlefields one after another. Everything had come to an end. It was not only because of Li Tianlan's awakening. It was also because they had developed to the extreme. If they could not break through this bottleneck, what awaited them was an inevitable end. Feng Qingwu lowered her head, no longer looking at the battlefields that covered the starry sky. Because everything was meaningless. She would not make a move. Just like how the human emperor of the human emperor palace would not make a move. It was really meaningless. Silence was only a choice. Fighting was also a choice. The so-called hope of victory had long been smashed into despair in the illusory reality. Therefore, whether it was persisting in fighting or remaining silent, it had become a choice. This was the only power they had. It was also the power that everyone had always had. At least they could choose how to die. Chapter 1096. The navigation system had failed, and the guide equipment had also failed half an hour ago. There was no mobile phone signal. For the rest of the journey, he could only rely on an ancient and primitive hand-drawn map to guide the way. There were dense trees and bushes that were enough to block the sun everywhere. Dozens of rare and highly poisonous creatures had been seen in just half a day, and this was the reason why he didn't deliberately look for them. The sense of direction could almost only be maintained by memory. Gu Xingyun stood in the extremely dense primeval forest and checked the hand-drawn map in his hand for a long time before he was sure that he should continue moving forward. The domain was mighty around him. Within a radius of more than 10 meters, any creature that bumped into the domain was completely crushed by it. Gu Xingyun walked forward, and his face became more and more cautious. This was an extremely ancient primeval forest in Nanyun, Jianghu State. It was not easy to distinguish the specific direction. Since entering this primeval forest 6 hours ago, Gu Xingyun had been rushing at full speed. Of course, his speed was not as fast as that of today's Li Tianlan, but he was an expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. Even if he was injured, he had advanced nearly 300 kilometers in this primeval forest in 6 hours. This was already deep in the primeval forest. It deviated from any route, had no tourist attractions, and was inaccessible. Primitive and ancient, it was not in any development plan of Jianghu State at all. If he hadn't come in person, Gu Xingyun wouldn't even know that this deep mountain forest was so big. The distance of hundreds of kilometers was obviously not all of this forest. According to the description on the hand-drawn map, it was at least 60 kilometers to reach the destination. The map was given by Jianghu. Since the news of Qin Fangqing's death spread throughout Jianghu state 4 days ago, Jiang Shangyu finally completely convinced Li Guangtu, and the three parties cooperated. In 3 days, Gu Xingyun had made some arrangements for the plan of the Special Warfare Group. In theory this cooperation could be achieved, but Gu Xingyun asked Jiang Shangyu to fulfill his promise first. So Gu Xingyun secretly came to Nanyun after attending the farewell ceremony of Qin Fangqing's body yesterday. After confirming that his whereabouts had not attracted anyone's attention, he quietly entered this primeval forest. The destination was said to be a village. That was the place where he and Jiang Shangyu had agreed. Gu Xingyun was a little excited. He knew very well what it meant for him to be here, and he was looking forward to what would happen next. Because if Jiang Shangyu didn't lie today or tomorrow when he left this primeval forest again, the injury that he had recuperated for a few years would be completely healed, and his broken martial arts path would be extended in front of him again. In a short time he might not be able to surpass the peak of the invincible realm and stand at the level of Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu. But according to Jiang Shangyu, if everything went well when he left here, he would at least be a top expert at the peak of the invincible realm. Gu Xingyun had been close to the peak of the invincible realm many years ago. However, his talent was not really top-notch, and the martial arts inheritance of Kunlun City did not record the scenery of the peak of the invincible realm, so he had been stuck in this bottleneck for many years. It was not until he was attacked by Li Tianlan on the eve of the maneuver of the two academies a few years ago that he saw the outline of the peak of the invincible realm in the almost perfect martial arts sword intent. So in the past 2 years, Kunlun City had been restraining and forbearance. At that time, Gu Xingyun didn't care about the temporary silence of Kunlun City and the temporary shrinkage of the Special Warfare Group, because everything was temporary. From that time on, he had made up his mind that as long as his injury got better and he entered the peak of the invincible realm, he would kill Li Tianlan at all costs. It didn't matter even if he had to completely become enemies with the giant group and face the endless revenge of the Dongqing clan and the Samsara Palace. He wanted to kill Li Tianlan as soon as he entered the peak of the invincible realm at all costs. No one could stop him. But the fact slapped Gu Xingyun hard in the face. There was no need for the giant group to stop him at all. After the maneuver of the two academies, Li Tianlan grew at an incredible speed. He didn't really enter the invincible realm, but he already had the power that almost surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. When everyone was talking about Li Tianlan being the top expert in the dark world, Gu Xingyun panicked, but his biggest feeling was helplessness. He tried his best to stop Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace, but it had little effect. Time seemed to be completely on Li Tianlan's side. Until Li Tianlan went to Kunlun City. Gu Xingyun lost. It was a fiasco. Because of Li Tianlan, he saw the scenery after the peak of the invincible realm. At the same time, because of fighting with Li Tianlan, he overdrew his potential and cut off his path. There was a storm inside the Special Warfare Group. Almost every day someone was investigated. In a short period of time, the Special Warfare Group had shrunk by nearly a third. Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace were like the sun at high noon. The Shengshi group and Emperor Dong's palace merged perfectly without any awkwardness. The new group rose. Things were hitting Gu Xingyun's nerves one by one. That was the most desperate time for Gu Xingyun. That was the real despair. He knew very well what it meant. Perhaps Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace were temporarily attracted by Qin Fangqing, but Gu Xingyun could be sure that once Qin Fangqing couldn't stop Li Tianlan and fell down, he and the Special Warfare Group would fall after Qin Fangqing. At the most pessimistic time he really planned to leave Jianghu State. Of course he didn't go to Annan State. If he wanted to leave Jianghu State, there were many places to go. Star State, the European continent, and even some superpowers second only to Jianghu State in the world such as Snow Country, extended an olive branch to him. Now there were few masters in the dark world. As the god of war of Jianghu State, even if his majesty was gone, he could go to any country and get the position of the god of war of that country and rebuild the order of the special warfare system. And those countries also came up with a relatively perfect plan. Compared with the seemingly generous promise of Annan State, Star State, England, France, Germany, and Snow Country all put forward almost perfect plans. They invited Gu Xingyun to go to their country. He didn't need to take anything from Jianghu State. He just needed to take the Gu family's team there. As long as they could land safely, they would negotiate with Jianghu State. This could be said to be a negotiation, and the conditions were so generous that Jianghu State could offer them casually. How important was a god of war who controlled the special warfare system? The special warfare system. It was no exaggeration to say that it was the order of a country in the dark. It can look loose, it can even look chaotic, but whatever, no matter what, it must be under control. The aftermath caused by the chaos in Snow Country had not completely subsided. Instead, it had become more and more intense. Most of the Invincible Realm experts on the divine and holy lists had fallen, and all the superpowers were leaderless. With no one in control of the situation, the order of the Dark World had completely collapsed. In some places, gangs, drug dealers, and killers began to emerge one after another. The crime rate skyrocketed, and all kinds of fights for interest took place every day. The chaos was not only spreading in the dark, but also on the surface. As time went by, no one knew how the situation would develop. Why could the Purgatory of Heaven capital and the current Emperor Dong's palace enter East Island? The royal family might not really welcome them to take root in East Island. But relatively speaking, they couldn't lose the order in the dark. So even if the person who controlled the order was not their favorite or even hated, they would accept it if they had no other choice. After the chaos in Snow Country, Gu Xingyun could be said to be one of the top experts in the Dark World. Everyone knew his current situation, so all the invitations to him were full of sincerity. According to Gu Xingyun's speculation, if he joined those powerful countries, this matter might really turn around. As long as those people met the conditions of Jianghu state, he and the Gu family had the possibility to continue to exist. But this was only for Jianghu state. Gu Xingyun was not afraid of Jianghu state. It was Li Tianlan. It had always been Li Tianlan. That was not realistic at all. If he stayed in Jianghu state, Li Tianlan might restrain himself. But once he left Jianghu state, even if he was temporarily safe, when Li Tianlan entered the Invincible Realm, where could he go? Even if he could run, how could the Gu family run? This was the most important reason why he had never made up his mind. If Jiang Shangyu hadn't taken the initiative to find him, he had even begun to consider the possibility of surrendering to Li Tianlan, giving up the position of the war god of the state, even giving up the leadership of the special warfare group. When there was really no turning back, groveling and begging Li Tianlan for mercy seemed to be the only feasible. This was also an important reason why he could accept Jiang Shangyu's proposal without difficulty. What Jiang Shangyu and Li Guangtu wanted was only 2/3 of the leadership of the special warfare group. After all, he could still keep 1/3 of his assets. As a condition of exchange, he didn't have to grovel and look at Li Tianlan's face. Jiang Shangyu could even make him really enter the peak of the Invincible Realm. It could even make him break through the peak of the Invincible Realm within a year or two, half a step into that supreme realm. What else did Gu Xingyun hesitate about? He directly agreed to cooperate. There were only some slight doubts in his heart. Jiang Shangyu had the example of going straight from the thundershocking realm to the half-step Invincible Realm overnight, and now he had the strength beyond the peak of the Invincible Realm. The iron-like fact made Gu Xingyun not have many doubts in his heart. The village deep in the forest was one of Jiang Shangyu's secret bases, and it also hid his biggest secret. And there was also the power that gave Gu Xingyun a new life. Gu Xingyun's heart was beating violently. He kept speeding up in the gradually quiet forest, identified the direction, and rushed directly to the destination. Chapter 1097. The forest was dense and deep. Gu Xingyun's speed changed from slow to fast, and finally from fast to slow. In the extremely dense primeval forest, he finally stopped where he was and looked around with a dignified look. Everything around him seemed to have changed. The world was quiet. The grass and trees were quiet. Gu Xingyun stood under a thick giant tree, frowning and looking around. He didn't speak for a long time. He didn't know why. He always felt that there was something wrong around him, but he didn't know what was wrong. A master's will was as firm as iron. The more powerful he was, the more he believed in his intuition. In the spiritual field, this was the subconscious. The uneasy intuition came from the subconscious. In his subjective consciousness, he couldn't find anything wrong, but it didn't mean that everything here was normal. It could only mean that he hadn't found anything abnormal yet. What on earth is wrong? Gu Xingyun focused his attention and looked around silently. The trees stood there quietly. There was no wind in the forest, not even any sound. The extreme silence with absolute weirdness made people feel more and more uneasy. It was as if everything around him had no life. The whole world seemed to be completely dead. Gu Xingyun's muscles gradually tightened. He didn't doubt the sincerity of Jiang Shangyu's cooperation with him. At least until now, he had never suspected that Jiang Shangyu wanted to hurt him. But the forest around him, which looked normal but extremely weird, made him feel more and more cold. Gu Xingyun didn't know why, but the fear deep in his heart began to spread little by little, making his whole body a little stiff. He took out the hand-drawn map again to confirm the location. It was less than 10 kilometers away from the destination. The direction was accurate. This also meant that he didn't go the wrong way. Then, what did this inexplicable feeling in front of him mean? Gu Xingyun stood there and hesitated for about half an hour. Then he slowly moved forward, step by step, and continued to move toward the destination. The forest seemed to be changing at any time, but it also seemed to be unchanged. The increasingly quiet atmosphere made Gu Xingyun feel that his breathing and heartbeat were extremely harsh. The sky seemed to be getting darker and darker. A drop of cold sweat dripped down Gu Xingyun's forehead and fell to the ground. Gu Xingyun walked carefully and subconsciously held his breath. The moment he held his breath, the ear-piercing sound seemed to have disappeared by a large margin. The incessant beating of his heart that was becoming more and more rapid seemed to have instantly turned into a deafening roar of thunder. Gu Xingyun's body froze in place. An unparalleled fear completely engulfed his will in an instant. He finally understood what was wrong. Silence. As they entered the forest, the environment became quieter and quieter. Several kilometers away, in the depths of the primeval forest, Gu Xingyun did not see any birds or beasts, not even a bug. This place was like a real land of death. Apart from himself, there were no other signs of life. The entire forest was extremely quiet. There were no living creatures, no wind, and even the branches and leaves of the surrounding trees did not move at all. It was as if everything had frozen here. It looked like a dense forest, but in fact it was a tomb full of corpses. Gu Xingyun stared at the trees in front of him quietly. All the trees around him were extremely thick, but the trunks and leaves were faintly black. The straight trees twisted into exaggerated shapes without any rules. Such an obvious change began with a little distortion. Perhaps the trees were in this state of distortion from the moment he entered the forest, but the distortion was very small. After he entered the forest, it began to enlarge little by little, so that now, if he did not pay close attention, Gu Xingyun would even think that this extremely exaggerated and strange distortion was normal. And the sunlight disappeared. Gu Xingyun could be sure that it was daytime. The forest might be dense, but there should be some subtle light here. But those lights had all disappeared at this time. It was dark all around. The forest of Nanyun seemed to have fallen into a cold winter, and the extremely cold temperature continued to spread in the increasingly thick darkness. Gu Xingyun concentrated on observing all the details around him. A hand fell on his shoulder without any warning. It penetrated his domain and even pinched his shoulder in a very friendly manner. Gu Xingyun, who was completely focused, jumped up almost in an instant. At the same time, his domain was extremely distorted, and the hand was directly thrown away from his shoulder. From the corner of his eyes, Gu Xingyun saw that it was a complete arm. The arm rotated in the air, and the slightly black blood kept dripping from the air. Where did the hand come from? This was a forest. Where did the hand come from? The problem was that there was no one here. Where did the hand come from? Gu Xingyun, who clearly felt that his shoulder was pinched, felt his heart beat wildly. Without any hesitation, he rushed directly to the place where the arm fell. The arm fell in a mass of vigorous grass. Gu Xingyun's figure followed closely. He stared at the grass carefully, as if he wanted to study the arm that did not look like a living person's. However, there was nothing in the bushes. There was no arm, no blood, only a dead branch that seemed to have been broken for a long time. Gu Xingyun looked at the grass in front of him and was silent for a long time. Was it his vision? Or the arm had been taken away? Who was here? Gu Xingyun suddenly glanced around in a 360-degree manner. In his sight, in the dark forest, there were only extremely twisted trees that looked extremely painful and fallen. Those trees were quietly twisted, like pairs of eyes, with ferocious malice, staring at his every move. Gu Xingyun swallowed and he began to step back. The feeling of uneasiness seemed to have broken through the limit of his heart. The destination for his breakthrough was not far away, but Gu Xingyun did not dare to go forward anyway. It was too strange here. Jianghu seemed to be too strange. He was ready to withdraw from the forest and go to the outside world to talk with Jianghu in detail. His retreat began to speed up, faster and faster. The dark, quiet and twisted forest kept retreating. Gu Xingyun's domain was fully open, and he flew in the dark forest. But there was no light in front of him. Everything seemed to be getting darker and darker. Gu Xingyun ran wildly for nearly half an hour before he stopped. He was sure that he could see the sun half an hour ago. But now he was retreating, returning to the original place. But in the past half an hour, there was no sun in front of him, and the surroundings became darker and colder. The extreme silence made all his sounds become manic. His breathing was like a hurricane and his heartbeat was like thunder. In such a quiet environment, Gu Xingyun could even hear the sound of his blood flowing in his body. It was the sound of the raging tide beating on the cliff like a tsunami. His face was pale and he took out the map with a slight tremble. The flame bloomed in his hand. In the subtle light, he looked at the map in his hand quietly. Perhaps it was a psychological effect, but no matter how he looked at it, he felt that this seemingly ancient hand-drawn map was also revealing a kind of strange feeling. The flame flickered in the darkness. He carefully identified everything around him, and the more he looked, the colder his heart became. He retreated for nearly half an hour. But judging from the extremely complicated marks on the map, instead of being far away from the forest, he was moving deeper. So far, he seemed to be less than a kilometer away from the real destination. His palm was sticky, and it seemed that he was sweating a lot because of nervousness. Gu Xingyun held the map in one hand and wiped his chest with the other. A touch of incomparably mournful red appeared on the clothes on his chest, forming an extremely gloomy bloody handprint. Blood. His other hand that was holding the map was also becoming sticky. Gu Xingyun's heart almost stopped beating. Slowly, in the darkness, he lowered his head little by little and looked at the map in his hand. It was getting darker and darker. It was getting quieter and quieter. In the extremely low visibility, he could only vaguely see that he seemed to be carrying something in his hand. It was like a map, but it seemed to be much bigger than a map. The strong smell of blood spread in the darkness. He could clearly feel that the thick liquid was constantly flowing from the palm of his hand holding the map. Gu Xingyun's arm trembled slightly. Shaking, he flicked out another flame. The flame illuminated the darkness. At that moment, Gu Xingyun saw the map in his hand. His heart suddenly stopped for a moment, and then he threw out the map in his hand like crazy. In his hand, the map, which had become much larger, was a complete human skin. Warm blood flowed down from under the human skin. The human skin was soft, but the face was stubbornly raised, smiling at Gu Xingyun in an extremely strange way. Fuck. Gu Xingyun covered his chest with one hand, and his eyes were wide open. The human skin that was thrown out fell on the tree. The trunk was instantly dyed red with blood. The thin layer of human skin smiled silently and strangely, moving quickly on the trunk. In just a second, Gu Xingyun felt dizzy, and the human skin had appeared upside down in front of him. Its body was hanging on the trunk closest to Gu Xingyun. Its head and feet were up, and the ferocious face full of blood was smiling at Gu Xingyun, while its empty eyes were staring at Gu Xingyun's eyes. His emotions seemed to have completely collapsed at this moment. Gu Xingyun was an expert of the invincible realm, and the war god of the nation. He had seen many opponents, but he had never seen this one. His emotions completely collapsed and he suddenly broke out with all his strength. The domain spread in all directions. Regardless of anything else, he chose a direction at random and rushed over. The violent domain swept through the woods. The forest was quiet and deathly still. The darkness retreated frantically. Gu Xingyun moved forward at full speed. 1 minute? Half a minute? Or maybe it was just a few seconds. A familiar ray of sunshine suddenly appeared in front of him. Gu Xingyun, who was almost in tears, rushed directly to the sunshine in front of him without any hesitation. The next second, all the darkness suddenly faded. The forest also appeared behind him. He rushed out of a dark forest and fell down gracelessly. He landed on a relatively flat patch of grass. The sun shone down, but there was no temperature. It was pale and almost false. But it was light after all. Gu Xingyun completely relaxed and he stared at the forest behind him. A dark forest was still staring at him quietly. The human skin did not rush out either. Gu Xingyun breathed a sigh of relief. He took out a cigarette with trembling hands and lit it. He took a big puff and calmed his inner fear. He didn't even have time to think about what was going on. The light around him made him feel safe instinctively. He just wanted to get out of here now. He didn't even realize how abnormal the cold wind was around him in the warm winter of Nanyun. The cigarette was soon finished. Gu Xingyun stood up and calmed himself down. He had a fear of this forest from the bottom of his heart, so he kept his back to the back, stared at the direction of the forest and slowly retreated. The grassland under his feet became flatter and flatter, and even the mottled old ground appeared. Gu Xingyun kept retreating until the back of his head touched something. Gu Xingyun's scalp went numb and he suddenly turned around. In his sight, a lantern that he had hit was swaying and floating. What appeared in front of Gu Xingyun was a very old wooden door. The lantern was not hung directly above the door, but in the middle. On the pale lantern, a big word "Shi" was written in red ink like blood. The white lantern and the red words made people feel uncomfortable no matter how they looked at it. Gu Xingyun carefully retreated for a distance and then looked around. All he could see were white lanterns everywhere. The red word "Shi" was everywhere. Old houses were neatly arranged on the street. Gu Xingyun seemed to be standing in the middle of the street. Gu Xingyun's heart began to sink, and it kept sinking. His face became pale and there was no color at all. The cold wind between heaven and earth seemed to be more mournful. The sun seemed to be gradually dimming. Gu Xingyun looked at the surrounding environment in silence. Here was a village. To be exact. This was the hand-drawn map. No, it was marked on the human skin. Destination. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.